Part 1. The Origin and Birth of Heracles. As Zeus, the king of the gods, sat on his golden throne atop Mount Olympus, he looked down through the clouds at the troubled land of Greece. The view from the sacred mountains stretched across the entire peninsula, from the rocky shores of the Augean to the dark forests of Arcadia. What he saw troubled him deeply. Cities burned in the distance, their smoke rising in dark columns into the sky. It was an age of chaos, ravaged by endless wars between rival kingdoms. Bronze weapons clashed in 100 different valleys as armies fought for scraps of territory. Meanwhile, ferocious beasts prowled the land. From deep caves emerged monsters born from the blood of ancient titans. Monstrous lions terrorized travelers on the roads, serpentine creatures poisoned entire rivers with their venom, and giants still walked the earth, feasting on any mortal unlucky enough to cross their path. Zeus knew what had to be done. Greece needed a hero, but not just any hero. It needed someone with divine blood flowing through their veins, someone strong enough to face the monsters that ordinary men could not defeat. He would father this champion himself, a mortal son who could walk among humans but possess the strength of the gods. This hero would unite the fractured people and rid the world of these terrible monsters once and for all. This hero was to be Heracles, though the Romans would later know him as Hercules. Zeus searched the mortal world carefully for the perfect mother, his divine eyes scanning the cities and villages of Greece. His gaze finally settled upon the beautiful Alcmena of Thebes, a wife of the general Amphitryon. She was not chosen at random. Alcmena was a descendant of the famous hero Perseus, the slayer of Medusa, and her bloodline already carried the seeds of greatness. Her beauty was renowned throughout Boeotia, but more importantly, she possessed virtue and strength of character that would shape a hero's heart. While her husband Amphitryon was away at war, fighting in a campaign against the Teleboans, Zeus descended from Olympus. The king of the gods took the form of Amphitryon himself, appearing at Alcmena's door one night covered in the dust of travel, carrying his shield and spear, speaking with her husband's voice. Alcmena welcomed him with joy, believing her husband had returned victorious from battle. Zeus lay with her that night, and to ensure his son's conception, he held back the dawn itself, stretching one night into the length of 3. In those extended hours, he planted the seed of the greatest hero Greece would ever know. When the real Amphitryon returned from battle the following day, Alcmena expressed confusion at his arrival, for she believed her husband had already come home. But the deed was done. Zeus had accomplished his plan, intending to make this child the next great king of Greece, ruler of the mighty city of Tiryns. Little did Zeus know that his wife, Hera, queen of the gods, had been watching these events unfold from her own throne on Olympus. Every moment she had observed, her jaw clenched in fury. In the past, she had endured Zeus's countless infidelities in bitter silence. She had watched him father illegitimate children with mortal women, nymphs, and even titanesses. Each betrayal had cut deep, but she had contained her rage, maintaining the dignity expected of the Queen of Olympus. But this time was different. This time she had finally had enough. The careful planning, the extended night, the intention to make this illegitimate child a king was more than she could bear. When Zeus, in his pride and foolishness, swore a sacred oath before all the gods, declaring that the next descendant of Perseus to be born would rule over Tiryns and become the greatest king in Greece, Hera saw her opportunity. As Alcmena's pregnancy neared its end, when the moment of Heracles' birth approached, Hera put her plan into action. She summoned Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, and commanded her to sit outside Alcmena's chamber with her legs crossed and her fingers interlocked, a magical gesture that would delay the birth. For 7 agonizing days and nights, Alcmena labored in terrible pain, unable to deliver her child while the goddess maintained her spell. Meanwhile, In the royal palace of Tiryns, Hera used her magic to speed up a different pregnancy. The queen there was also carrying a descendant of Perseus, a child who would be called Eurystheus. Through Hera's intervention, this infant was born prematurely but healthy, entering the world just hours before Heracles finally emerged. When Zeus discovered the deception, it was already too late. The moment the news reached Olympus, thunder rolled across Greece, and lightning split the sky. Eurystheus, weak and cowardly though he would prove to be, had been born first. He was now the next descendant of Perseus to enter the world, and Zeus was bound by his own sacred oath to give him the kingship. The foundations of Olympus trembled with the god's fury, marble columns cracking, divine halls shaking, but for all his rage, even the king of the gods could not break an oath he had sworn before all the immortals. While Zeus could do nothing about his son's lost kingdom, he devised his own revenge on Hera. One night, shortly after Heracles was born, Zeus entered Hera's bedchamber on Olympus. The vast chamber was silent except for Hera's deep, regular breathing. In his arms, Zeus carried the infant Heracles, wrapped in a simple blanket, and placed him on Hera's breast. The hungry infant immediately began to nurse, but this was no ordinary feeding. With each swallow, Heracles absorbed some of Hera's immortal power, her divine essence flowing into his tiny body and strengthening his muscles and bones far beyond those of ordinary men. Suddenly, Hera woke, feeling the strange sensation at her breast. Looking down in the dim light, she saw what was happening and shrieked in rage and disgust. With a violent motion, she threw the baby off her chest, sending him tumbling through the air. Her divine milk sprayed across the heavens in a great arc, the droplets spreading and glowing with ethereal light. This milk would settle out in the vastness of space, crystallizing into countless stars, becoming known to mortals as the Milky Way, a permanent reminder of her humiliation written across the night sky. Zeus caught the infant before he could fall, chuckling to himself at his clever revenge. He brought Heracles back to earth, placing him gently in a wooden cradle next to his mother Alcmena. The baby settled quietly, his body now filled with the stolen divine power. Back on Olympus, Hera paced her chambers in fury, her robes swirling around her. This was too great an embarrassment for the queen of the gods to ignore. The theft of her divine essence, the mark now written across the heavens, demanded retribution. That very night, she summoned 2 venomous serpents from the depths of the earth, sending them slithering through the darkness towards Thebes, towards the house where Heracles slept. The serpents crept through a window into the nursery, their scales grating against the stone floor. They reared up over the cradle, ready to strike at the sleeping infant. But when they lunged forward, something extraordinary happened. Baby Heracles opened his eyes and giggled with delight, as if someone had given him new toys to play with. His tiny hands reached out and seized one serpent in each fist. The serpents thrashed and coiled, trying desperately to escape or bite, but the infant's grip was like iron. Heracles laughed louder, a sound of pure joy as he squeezed tighter and tighter. The bones in the serpents' necks cracked and splintered. Their eyes bulged, their tongues protruded, and finally they went limp. When Alcmena and the servants rushed in, drawn by the baby's laughter, they found Heracles holding 2 dead snakes like cloth dolls, still laughing with innocent joy. High on Olympus, Hera looked down at the scene, her face white with rage. The strength he had stolen from her divine milk had saved him. Her own power had been turned against her. As she watched the mortals celebrate the miracle, as they praised the strong child who would surely become a great hero, Hera made a solemn vow. If she could not kill Heracles directly, she would ensure his life was filled with suffering. She would turn his strength against him and ensure that any glory he earned would come through unbearable suffering. This child might live, but Hera would make certain he would never know peace. Part 2. The Youth of Heracles. Growing up in Thebes, Heracles received an education from some of the most renowned masters of Greece. His days followed a strict routine set by Amphitryon, who was determined to shape the boy into a worthy warrior. Before dawn, while darkness still covered the valley, Heracles would train with sword and spear in the courtyard, learning from Castor, one of the finest warriors in Greece. As the sun climbed higher, he practiced wrestling with Autolycus, who taught him holds and throws that could bring down men twice his size. The afternoon brought archery practice with the master Eurytus, who could send an arrow through a bronze ring at 100 paces, followed by chariot driving with Amphitryon himself on the plains outside the city walls. Only when evening fell did the lessons turn to gentler arts, when Linus attempted to teach him music and poetry. During these evening music lessons, Heracles' dangerous temper began to show. The divine strength he had stolen from Hera's breast all those years ago had come with a terrible price. Along with muscles that could bend iron and bones that could not break, Heracles had developed a temper as fierce as his strength was great. When rage took him, his face would redden, his massive hands would tremble, and his eyes would cloud over with something his teachers learnt to fear. This combination of supernatural power and uncontrollable anger made him dangerous to everyone around him. Linus, his music teacher, failed to recognize the danger. He was a respected bard from Thrace who had taught princes throughout Greece, a man who believed that discipline in music created discipline in life. 3 times a week, he would attempt to teach Heracles the lyre, an elegant instrument of 7 strings stretched across a frame of polished tortoiseshell. But those enormous fingers that could already bend bronze struggled with the delicate plucking required. Hour after hour, the wrong notes would sound in the stone chamber, each mistake building the young hero's frustration. The fatal moment came during a particularly hot afternoon in late summer, when the air hung heavy and still. Heracles had been struggling with the same melody for the better part of an hour, his fingers slipping on strings slick with sweat. When another discordant note rang out, Linus finally lost his patience. "You play like a barbarian," the teacher shouted, his voice sharp. "You have no more musical sense than an ox. Perhaps we should send you back to the stables where you belong." With that, Linus struck Heracles across the head with his rod, the same thin stick he used to beat time. It was not the first time he had hit his student, but it would be the last. Before Linus could raise the rod again, Heracles seized the lyre and brought it crashing down on the back of his teacher's skull. The beautiful instrument shattered, tortoiseshell splintering, strings snapping with tiny shrieks. Linus dropped without a sound, blood already pooling beneath his head on the floor. When the rage cleared and Heracles saw what he had done, he stood frozen over his teacher's body. At the trial that followed, Heracles cited the law of Rhadamanthus, which stated that whoever defends himself against one who uses violence should go free. The magistrates, faced with the fact that Linus had indeed struck first, ruled it justifiable defence and sentenced Heracles to exile rather than death. But this would not be the last time his terrible strength and uncontrolled temper would bring tragedy. Part 3. The Madness of Heracles. A few years passed, and war soon found its way to Thebes. When Heracles' foster father Amphitryon fell in battle against the Minians, the city faced certain destruction. In desperation, the elders turned to young Heracles to lead their demoralized army. As Heracles prepared to face the enemy, Athena herself appeared on the road before him, sent by Zeus to aid his son. She presented him with 3 gifts: a bronze breastplate forged by Hephaestus, a sword that would hold its edge in battle, and a perfectly balanced spear. Armed with these sacred arms, Heracles led the Thebans onto the battlefield, where he destroyed the Minian army in a single afternoon. Upon returning to Thebes as a victorious general, Heracles was greeted at the city gates by King Creon, who had come personally to welcome the hero who had saved his kingdom from ruin. Overjoyed, and with his city saved, the king offered the greatest reward in his power. He would give Heracles his eldest daughter, Megara, as a bride. The wedding took place within the month, with feasting that lasted 3 full days and nights. Wine flowed from 100 amphoras, and the people of Thebes danced in the streets, celebrating their saviour's good fortune. For several years, Heracles and Megara lived in peace in a fine house near the marketplace of Thebes. Their home was filled with the laughter of 3 strong sons, boys who showed early signs of inheriting their father's remarkable strength. Each morning, Heracles would lift them onto his shoulders and carry them through the marketplace, where merchants and citizens would bow their heads in respect. He had become the city's greatest hero, the protector who had saved them from the Minians. When old King Creon died, many believed Heracles would surely take the throne. This good fortune was observed by many on Olympus, but none watched as closely as Hera. Every happy moment, every smile from his children, every embrace from his wife, fed her growing fury. This was not what she had planned for the illegitimate son of her husband. Not only had this child stolen her divine power all those years ago when he nursed at her breast, but now he prospered. He had a loving family, the adoration of an entire city, and stood in line to become the next king of Thebes. The very thought made her jaw clench with rage. The Queen of Olympus would not allow such disrespect. The time had come to destroy Heracles in a way that no amount of strength could prevent. On an ordinary afternoon in early autumn, when the leaves were just beginning to turn gold, Heracles returned from the gymnasium. The door to his house hung off its hinges, splintered and broken. The courtyard beyond was steeped in an unnatural silence. No servants came to greet him, no children's voices called out. Fear gripped his heart. He called for Megara, for his sons. No answer came. Drawing his sword, he rushed through the entrance. What he saw in the courtyard stopped him cold. 3 massive creatures crouched over huddled forms on the ground, beings so hideous that his mind struggled to process them. They had scales, multiple heads that turned independently, and teeth like daggers dripping with venom. One of them looked up from its prey and let out a shriek that made his ears ring. In that terrible sound, though he did not know it, was woven Hera's magic. Rage took hold of Heracles, different from anything he had felt in battle. He roared and threw himself at the nearest creature, striking it with his fist. The thing's head cracked open, dark blood spraying across the courtyard. The second creature tried to flee, scrambling on multiple legs towards the doorway. Heracles caught it in 3 strides, his hands finding its throat. He lifted it from the ground as if it weighed nothing, squeezing until he felt cartilage crack and collapse beneath his fingers. The thing made horrible gurgling sounds as it died, its many eyes rolling back in its head. He threw the corpse aside and turned to face the last monster. This one was different. It cowered against the wall, whimpering and raising its arms as if begging for mercy. But Heracles was beyond mercy, beyond thought. He grabbed the creature and began to strike it again and again, his fists rising and falling in a terrible rhythm. Even after it stopped moving, he continued, driven by a fury that seemed to come from outside himself, as if invisible hands were guiding his own. Only when his arms grew too heavy to lift did the rage begin to fade. Heracles stood alone in the quiet courtyard, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. The stones around him were painted with gore. Then Hera's illusion lifted from his eyes. The monsters vanished like smoke. The dark blood on the walls was now red, mortal blood. Where the hideous creatures had been, now lay his family. Megara sprawled near the fountain where the first monster had crouched, her skull crushed by his fist. His eldest son lay by the doorway, his throat bearing the purple marks of his father's fingers. Against the wall, barely recognizable, was his youngest boy, the one who had raised his small arms, not in threat, but as a plea for his father to stop. Heracles understood what he had done. He fell to his knees and crawled from body to body, unable to accept what lay before him. He gathered Megara into his arms, smoothing her hair, whispering her name. He touched each son's face, as if gentle touches now could undo the violence of moments before. "No," he whispered, then louder, "No!" His cries brought neighbors running, but when they saw the scene, they fled in terror. The great hero Heracles sat among the bodies of his family, tears running down his face, mixing with their blood on his hands. As night fell, and Heracles remained in that courtyard of death, he knew what fate awaited him. In Greece, the murder of blood relatives was the most heinous crime imaginable. Already he could feel them stirring in the depths of the earth, the Furies, ancient spirits of vengeance who hunted those who murdered their own family. 3 sister goddesses with snakes for hair, they would rise from the underworld and pursue him to the ends of the earth, driving him mad with their screaming until he found a way to atone. There was only one place where he might find an answer. The oracle at Delphi, the sacred shrine where Apollo spoke through his priestess, could tell him how to cleanse himself of these murders. Heracles wrapped his family in funeral shrouds with his own hands, built their pyres from wood he cut himself, and watched the flames carry them to the afterlife. No one from Thebes came to help him. He was cursed now, and none would go near him. When the ashes cooled, he left the city forever, taking nothing but the clothes on his back, and began walking south towards Delphi. The journey took 7 days across the slopes of Mount Parnassus. Other travellers saw him coming and stepped off the road, recognizing the mark of blood guilt that hung about him like a shadow. When Heracles finally climbed the sacred way to Apollo's temple, his feet bleeding from the rocky path, the temple priests tried to bar his way, but the Pythia, Apollo's oracle at Delphi, called out that the god would receive him. Heracles entered the temple and was led to the inner chamber where the oracle sat. The room was dark, lit only by a single flame burning in a bronze bowl. In the center, the Pythia sat on a 3-legged stool positioned over a crack in the stone floor. Steam rose from this fissure, carrying a strange, sweet smell that made his head swim. The priestess was a young woman, her eyes already unfocused as she breathed in the vapors that rose from below. These fumes, the priests claimed, came from the corpse of the dragon Python that Apollo had slain when he claimed this sacred ground. As Heracles knelt before her, the Pythia's body began to shake. Her head rolled back, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer her own. It was deeper, resonating through the chamber as if the god himself were present. But on this day, unknown to all who watched, Hera had tainted the sacred vapors with her own magic.
"Heracles, son of Zeus,"
the voice boomed through the darkness.
"To atone for the blood on your hands, you must serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae for 10 full years. You must obey his every command, no matter how difficult or demeaning."
Heracles' fists clenched involuntarily at the name. Eurystheus, that weak, cowardly king who had stolen his birthright by being born mere hours before him. The man who should have been his subject would now be his master. To serve such a man would be the ultimate humiliation. But the oracle was not finished.
"If you complete this service," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "your father Zeus will grant you immortality. You will join the gods on Olympus and never know death."
Heracles stood silent for a long moment. The Furies were already gathering outside the temple. Apollo's sacred grove held them at bay, but he could hear their wings rustling in the darkness, waiting for him to leave the sanctuary. He bowed his head in acceptance. He rose from his knees, turned his back on the oracle, and began the long walk to Mycenae. Above him, on her throne in Olympus, Hera smiled. The labours that awaited him would make him wish for death 1,000 times over. But death, she had ensured, would not come easily to Heracles. Part 4. The Labours of Heracles. Labour 1. The Nemean Lion. King Eurystheus had known of Heracles for some time and was deeply jealous of him. The two were cousins, both descended from the hero Perseus, but there the similarity ended. Where Heracles was tall and powerfully built, with muscles earned through years of combat, Eurystheus was thin and pale, his shoulders narrow beneath his royal robes. Where Heracles had led armies and slain monsters, Eurystheus had inherited his throne through Hera's trickery, spending his days hiding behind palace walls while others fought his battles. Every story of Heracles' victories made the king's resentment grow stronger. When Heracles arrived at the palace in Mycenae to begin his servitude, the guards led him to the great hall. There he had to force himself to bow before his cousin. The hero who had destroyed the minion army now knelt on the cold stone floor. Across from him sat Eurystheus, a man so nervous he flinched at sudden movements. The king leaned forward, unable to suppress his delight at seeing the mighty Heracles finally brought low. "I accept your service," Eurystheus said, his reedy voice echoing off the walls. "You will complete 10 labours over 10 years. Each task I set you, you must accomplish alone, without assistance from god or man. You will receive no payment, no glory. These are my terms." Heracles kept his eyes on the floor. "I understand." "Good. Then I have your first labour ready." The king paused, savouring the moment. "In the hills above Nemean, there lives a lion, unlike any other. Its hide is golden and cannot be pierced by any weapon forged by man. Its claws can slice through bronze shields as if they were parchment. For 2 years it has terrorized the region, killing shepherds, devouring traders on the roads. Entire villages have been abandoned in fear." Eurystheus watched Heracles closely. 30 of my finest soldiers have fallen to this beast. Their bones fill its lair. You shall travel to Nemean and destroy this creature. Return with proof of its death, or do not return at all." Heracles rose to his feet and left without another word. He knew this was meant to be his death sentence. No mortal weapon could harm a creature with impenetrable skin, but as he walked the dusty road from Mycenae, he began to form a plan. If weapons were useless, then he would have to rely on the strength that he had strangled serpents with when he was still an infant. For 3 months, Heracles prepared in the mountains outside Nemean. Each morning before dawn he would find the largest boulder he could move and carry it up the steepest slope he could find. When that became easy, he found a larger one. He practiced wrestling holds on tree trunks until the bark crumbled beneath his fingers. He uprooted ancient oaks to strengthen his arms and shoulders, trees that 20 men with ropes could not budge. By the end of his training, his hands could crush stones to powder. The path to the lion's cave wound through a valley littered with the evidence of the beast's reign of terror. Heracles passed abandoned farms, their walls scratched with deep claw marks. He found merchant wagons overturned on the road, their cargo thrown across the path, dark stains where their owners had died. As he climbed higher into the hills, he began to find human bones, picked clean and left scattered in the sun. The cave mouth was wide and dark. The smell of rotting flesh drifted out from within. Just inside the entrance lay the remains of the warriors who had come before him. Their bronze armour was torn open, their swords and spears snapped in half. One skeleton still clutched a shattered axe, its blade cracked where it had struck the lion's hide. Heracles stood at the cavern's entrance and began to move his equipment. First went the sword Athena had given him, then the divine armour that had protected him against the minions. Piece by piece he laid them on a flat stone near the cave mouth. These gifts from the gods had served him in his old life, but this labour required something different. When he stood naked, except for a loincloth, he called into the darkness, "Lion of Nemean, I am Heracles. I have come for you." A growl rumbled from deep within the cave. Then came the sound of claws scraping against stone, growing closer. When Heracles finally saw it clearly, he understood why so many had died. The beast was massive, larger than any normal lion, with a golden hide and a mane thick and tangled like thorns. Its eyes held an intelligence that was almost human. This was no ordinary creature, but a child of Typhon and Echidna, the ancient titans who had spawned many of Greece's terrors. The lion studied Heracles for a moment, perhaps puzzled by this man who came without weapons. Then it charged. The ground shook beneath its weight as it bounded forward, its mouth opening to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. At the last second, just as those terrible jaws were about to close on him, Heracles dove to the side and wrapped his arms around the beast's neck from behind. The lion roared and thrashed, trying to shake him off. Its claws raked the air, seeking flesh to tear. They rolled across the rocky ground, the lion's incredible weight shattering rocks beneath them. Heracles held on with all his strength, his muscles straining, his hands locked together beneath the beast's jaw. The lion slammed him against the cave wall, trying to break his grip, but Heracles would not let go. For hours they struggled as the sun moved across the sky. The lion's roars echoed through the valley, sending the people of distant Nemean running to lock their doors. Blood ran from dozens of scratches on Heracles' body where the lion's claws had found him, but still he held on. His arms burned with exhaustion, his hands cramped from gripping so tightly, but he knew that letting go meant death. As darkness approached, Heracles felt the lion beginning to tire. Its struggles grew weaker, its roars becoming gasps for air. This was his moment. With a final surge of strength, he shifted his grip to the lion's throat and squeezed with every bit of power in his body. The beast gave one last shudder and then was still. Heracles released his hold and collapsed beside the dead lion, his chest heaving. When he could stand again, he bowed his head to the magnificent creature.
"You fought well," he said quietly. "I will honor your strength."
He tried to skin the lion with a sharp rock, but the hide would not give way. His sword was equally useless against it. Then he remembered the lion's own claws. Taking one, he found it could cut through the golden pelt where metal had failed. Working through the night, he carefully removed the hide in one piece. When dawn came, Heracles draped the lion's skin over his shoulders, using the beast's head as a hood, its jaw resting on his forehead like a helmet. The golden hide that no weapon could pierce would now protect him. As he prepared to leave, he saw his divine armor still lying where he had left it. He did not pick it up. That belonged to his old life, before the madness, before the murders. This lion skin would be his new armor, earned through his own strength. On his way back to Mycenae, he found a massive oak tree. With his bare hands, he tore it from the earth and stripped away its branches, carving the trunk into a heavy club. This would be his weapon now, simple and direct, like the path before him. When Heracles walked through the gates of Mycenae, still wearing the lion's skin, people fled in terror, thinking the beast itself had come to devour them. But when they recognized the man beneath the golden hood, word spread quickly through the city. Heracles had done the impossible. He had killed the Nemean lion with his bare hands. Eurystheus was in the throne room when Heracles entered. The king froze at what he saw. His cousin stood in the doorway, wearing the golden pelt of the lion, its dead jaws resting atop his head like a crown. This was the creature that had killed 30 soldiers, and Heracles wore it like a cloak. The king's fingers dug into the wooden arms of his throne, nearly splintering the carved oak. He had sent Heracles to die in those hills. Instead, the hero had returned more fearsome than before. His first labor was complete. Labor 2. The Lernean Hydra. For his second labor, Heracles was sent to kill the Lernean Hydra, a task Eurystheus believed would surely succeed where the lion had failed. The king had heard terrible reports from the marshland near Argos, where entire villages had been abandoned after the monster emerged from its lair. And so Heracles travelled south from Mycenae to Lake Lerna, a cursed place where birds fell dead from the sky and the water bubbled with foul gases from below. The Hydra was unlike any creature that walked or swam in Greece. Born from the same union of Typhon and Echidna that had produced the Nemean lion, it had grown enormous in these fetid swamps. The beast had 9 heads that swayed on long serpentine necks, including one immortal head that would not die even when severed from the body. Its breath alone could kill a man, and its blood was the most poisonous substance in the known world. Even its tracks, where it had slithered through the mud, left trails of dead vegetation that would not grow again for years. As Heracles made his way through the marshes towards the creature's lair, Hera watched from Olympus with growing frustration. Her nephew had survived the lion, even turning its hide into armor. This time she would ensure he did not walk away victorious. With a gesture of her divine hand, she sent a giant crab, the size of a large house, to hide beneath the murky waters of Lake Lerna. It would wait there, unseen, until the moment was right. Heracles arrived at the lake just after dawn. The air smelled of rot and decay, and no birds sang in the blackened trees that grew along the shore. He could see the entrance to the Hydra's cave on a small rise above the water, surrounded by the bones of cattle and men who had ventured too close. Having gained confidence from his victory over the Nemean lion, Heracles decided on a direct approach. He dipped his arrows in pitch and set them alight, firing them into the cave to force the creature out. The strategy worked. With a terrible hissing that sounded like 100 serpents, the Hydra emerged into the daylight. The monster was even more horrifying than the stories had claimed. Each of its 9 heads was larger than a grown man, with jaws that could swallow a warrior whole. Its body was thick as an ancient oak, and as it moved towards him, the venom dripped onto the ground, blackening the earth and sending up wisps of smoke. Heracles charged forward with his club raised high. His first swing connected perfectly, taking one of the Hydra's heads clean off at the neck. But the severed head rolled into the lake with a splash, its jaws still snapping at the air. But as Heracles stepped back to aim another blow, he watched in horror as the stump began to bubble and swell. Within moments, 2 new heads burst forth from where one had been, both fully formed and hissing with rage. Confused but determined, Heracles swung again, removing another head. Again, 2 more grew in its place. He tried using his sword, desperately hacking at the necks, but the result was always the same. Where he had faced 9 heads, now there were 12, then 15, then 20, each one lunging at him with venomous fangs. The multiplication was relentless. Soon he was surrounded by a forest of snapping heads. It was then that Hera's trap was sprung. The giant crab burst from the lake behind Heracles, its massive jaws closing around his leg. The hero fell hard onto the muddy ground, his club flying from his hand. The crab's grip was crushing, its massive claws clamping around his leg with tremendous force. Even through the Nemean lion's hide, Heracles could feel the pressure threatening to break his bones. With the Hydra's many heads descending towards him and the crab holding him fast, Heracles knew his death was moments away. Then, suddenly, an arrow whistled through the air, striking the Hydra and its thick body. The heads recoiled in surprise, turning towards this new threat. Heracles twisted his head to see his nephew Iolaus standing at the edge of the clearing, already knocking another arrow to his bow. The boy had followed his uncle from Mycenae, despite being told to stay behind, determined to help however he could. "Uncle, the crab!" Iolaus shouted, firing another arrow to keep the Hydra's attention. With the monsters momentarily distracted, Heracles grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and brought it down on the crab's joint where its claw met its body. The shell cracked, and the grip loosened just enough. Heracles pulled free, rolled towards his fallen club, and came up swinging. Furious at being pinned down like helpless prey, he brought his club down on the crab with all his strength. The blow was tremendous, crushing through its shell and killing it instantly, dark blue blood pouring onto the muddy ground. But the Hydra remained, now with over 30 heads weaving through the air, striking at them from every direction. Iolaus ran to his uncle's side, and as they stood together facing the monster, the young man had an idea. "Fire, uncle," he said, pointing to the still burning arrows that had driven the Hydra from its cave. "If the wounds are burned, perhaps they cannot regrow." The solution was simple and clever. Iolaus gathered branches and lit them from the burning arrows, creating makeshift torches. They developed a rhythm. Heracles would slice through a neck with his sword, and immediately Iolaus would press the flaming torch to the stump, searing it closed before new heads could emerge. The stench of burning flesh filled the air, making both men cover their noses as they worked. For hours they laboured together, uncle and nephew working as one, watching the forest of heads slowly diminish. The Hydra grew weaker with each cauterized stump, its movements slower, until finally only the immortal head remained, hissing defiantly at them. This head could not be killed, Heracles knew. So he cut it off with one final swing of his sword, and while it still lived, snapping and spitting venom, He dug a deep hole in the ground beside the lake. He dropped the writhing head into the pit, then found a massive boulder nearby. The rock was so heavy that even Heracles strained to lift it, his muscles burning with the effort. He carried it to the hole and dropped it on top, sealing the immortal head beneath tons of stone. Even now, some say, if you put your ear to that very rock, you can still hear the muffled hissing from below. With the Hydra defeated, Heracles knelt beside its body and carefully dipped the tips of his arrows in the monster's poisonous blood. From this day forward, the slightest scratch from one of these arrows would mean certain death. He filled a sealed jar with more of the venom, knowing it would prove valuable in the labours to come. When Heracles returned to Mycenae with news of his victory, Eurystheus received him in the great hall. The king listened to the tale with a scowl on his face, but said nothing about the labour being invalid. In his mind, however, Eurystheus had already decided not to count it. Heracles had been aided by his nephew, which violated the terms that all labours must be completed alone. The king kept this decision to himself for now, planning to demand an 11th labour when the time came. Heracles left the hall unaware of this trickery, believing he had completed his second task. As for the giant crab that had nearly cost Heracles his life, Hera retrieved its remains from the marsh. In honour of its service, she placed the image among the stars, where it became the constellation Cancer, forever crawling across the night sky as a reminder of the battle at Lake Lerna. Labour 3. The Cerynean Hind. For his third labour, Heracles was ordered to catch the Cerynean hind and bring it back alive to Eurystheus. This sacred deer was larger than any normal stag, with hooves of bronze that struck sparks from the rocks as it ran. Most remarkable of all were its antlers, made of solid gold, that caught the sunlight as it bounded through the forests. This was one of only 5 such creatures in all the world, and 4 of them pulled the chariot of Artemis herself, goddess of the hunt. Eurystheus had chosen this task with particular cunning. The hind was not dangerous like the lion or the Hydra, but it was sacred to Artemis, and the goddess was known for her terrible vengeance against those who harmed her beloved animals. The king knew that capturing the creature would require either killing it or injuring it, and either action would bring down the wrath of an Olympian. Even if Heracles somehow managed to catch the hind without harm, Artemis would surely strike him down for daring to touch what belonged to her. No mortal, no matter how strong, could stand against a goddess. Heracles understood the trap that had been set for him. He could not use his strength or his poisoned arrows. This labour would require patience, something the hero had never possessed in abundance. With his preparations complete, he set off for Mount Cerynea in Arcadia, where the golden-antlered deer made its home. The hunt began in spring, when wildflowers covered the mountain slopes. Heracles first spotted the hind drinking from a clear mountain stream, its golden antlers reflecting in the water. He approached slowly, carefully, but the creature's ears twitched at the slightest sound. It raised its head, saw him, and fled with a speed that left Heracles standing in amazement. The hind moved like the wind itself, leaping over fallen trees and streams as if they were not there, covering ground faster than any horse could gallop. For months, Heracles pursued the creature through the mountains. He learnt its paths, the meadows where it grazed at dawn, the springs where it drank at midday, the groves where it rested in the afternoon heat. But whenever he drew close, the hind would bound away, always staying just beyond his reach. Summer turned to autumn. The leaves changed from green to gold and red, and still the chase continued. When winter came and snow covered the mountains, Heracles thought the hind would surely begin to tire. But the creature ran across the snowfields as easily as it had across summer grass, leaving delicate tracks that Heracles followed day after day. His beard grew long and frost-covered. His lion's skin became heavy with ice, but he would not give up. Spring returned to the mountains, a full year since the hunt had begun, and still the golden-antlered deer eluded him. Finally, as the hind approached the river Ladon to drink, Heracles saw his chance. He could not wound the sacred animal, but perhaps he could frighten it. Drawing his bow, he aimed not at the creature, but at the ground near its feet. The arrow struck the river bank with a loud crack, startling the hind. In its surprise, it leapt directly into the deep, swift-flowing river. The water was cold from mountain snows, and the current was strong. For the first time, the magical deer struggled, its slender legs working hard against the flow. Heracles dove in after it, his powerful arms pulling him through the water. He reached the hind just as it was beginning to tire, gently wrapping his arms around its neck, careful not to harm it. He guided it to the shore, and while it was still exhausted from the swim, he carefully bound its legs with a soft rope that would not cut its delicate skin. Lifting the creature onto his shoulders, Heracles began the journey back to Mycenae. But the moment he stepped beyond the boundaries of Mount Cerynea, the sky darkened. There was a flash of silver light, and Artemis herself stood before him, her bow drawn, an arrow aimed directly at his heart. "Thief!" she cried. "You dare to steal what belongs to me! That creature is sacred to me, and you shall die for this insult." Heracles immediately dropped to one knee, keeping the hind carefully balanced on his shoulder. "Great Artemis," he said, his eyes on the ground, "I am no thief. I act under the command of King Eurystheus, to whom I am bound by divine law. I have not harmed your creature, not a single golden hair. See for yourself, there is no blood, no injury." Before Artemis could respond, another figure appeared beside her in a shimmer of light. It was Apollo, her twin brother, his hand gently touching her drawn bow. "Sister," he said quietly, "listen to his words. This is Heracles, another son of Zeus. Remember how Hera persecuted our mother Leto when she carried us, driving her across the earth, preventing her from finding a place to give birth?" Apollo turned to Heracles. "Does Eurystheus act under Hera's command? Does she hope my sister will slay you for this perceived crime?" Heracles nodded, still kneeling. "The Queen of Olympus seeks my death through any means." Artemis lowered her bow slightly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The idea of thwarting Hera's plans appealed to her. "Very well," she said. "You may take my hind to show Eurystheus, but you must swear by the Styx that you will release it unharmed the moment your labour is witnessed as complete." "I swear it," Heracles said solemnly. The twin gods vanished in a burst of light, and Heracles continued to Mycenae. When he entered the throne room with the divine creature still living on his shoulders, Eurystheus could not hide his disappointment. He had been certain that either the year-long hunt would break Heracles' spirit, or Artemis would slay him. True to his oath, Heracles released the Cerynean hind outside the palace gates. The creature bounded away towards Mount Cerynea, disappearing into the forest within moments. As Heracles watched it go, he felt something he had not experienced since the beginning of his labours, a moment of peace. He had captured a divine creature without harming it, faced down a goddess and lived, and completed an impossible task through patience rather than strength. But when he turned back to the throne room, Eurystheus was already preparing his next command. The king's eyes were cold, calculating. 3 labours completed, 7 more to go. Or so Heracles believed. Labour 4. The Erymanthian Boar. For his 4th labour, Eurystheus sent Heracles to Mount Erymanthus to capture alive a giant boar that had been ravaging the countryside. The beast had descended from the high mountain slopes during an especially harsh winter, destroying vineyards and killing livestock. The king wanted the creature brought back alive, perhaps hoping the difficulty of subduing rather than killing such a monster would finally defeat his cousin. Not thinking much of the task, Heracles set off with unusual enthusiasm. After 3 labours that had tested him in different ways, a simple boar hunt seemed almost refreshing. Besides, the path to Mount Erymanthus would take him near the cave of his old centaur friend Pholus, who Heracles decided to visit along the way. Centaurs were creatures of 2 natures, with the torso and head of a man joined to the body of a horse. Most were wild and violent, ruled by their animal instincts rather than reason. They lived in mountain caves, fought constantly among themselves, and were known to attack travellers without provocation. But Pholus was different. He was gentle and thoughtful, one of only 2 civilized centaurs in all of Greece. Heracles had known him since his youth, when Pholus had helped train him in tracking and hunting. The cave where Pholus lived was high on a wooded slope, with its entrance hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. When Heracles called out, Pholus emerged with obvious delight, embracing his old friend warmly. The centaur's cave was surprisingly comfortable, with woven rugs on the floor and shelves carved into the rock walls holding scrolls and various supplies. "My friend," Pholus said, "you must stay for dinner. I'll invite some of the local centaurs to meet the famous Heracles. Even my father, Silenus, might come down from the high peaks." As Pholus prepared for the feast, he sent word to one other civilized centaur in the region, Chiron, who lived on nearby Mount Pelion. Chiron was not just intelligent, but immortal, a son of the Titan Kronos. He had taught many of Greece's greatest heroes, including Heracles himself, who had learnt archery from him as a boy. When the old centaur arrived at the cave that evening, his mane now grey with age, Heracles bowed deeply in respect. The feast began well enough. They dined on roasted venison that Pholus had hunted that morning, and bread made from mountain wheat. Heracles sat between his 2 friends, sharing stories of his labours. Chiron listened with interest, as his former student described wrestling the Nemean lion and tracking down the golden-antlered Hind for a full year. Other centaurs had gathered outside the cave, drawn by curiosity, but too wild to join the civilized dinner. They prowled among the trees, stamping their hooves and muttering to each other in the darkness. As the evening wore on and the conversation continued, Heracles excused himself to walk outside and clear his head. The mountain air was cool and crisp, filled with the scent of pine. As he wandered back through Pholus's cave, something caught his eye, a large ceramic jar on a high shelf, sealed with wax and covered in dust. The jar seemed to call to him, and without thinking, Heracles reached up and brought it down. The moment he broke the seal, a rich, powerful aroma filled the cave. The wine inside had been a gift from the god Dionysus himself, given to all the centaurs 4 generations ago. It was meant to be communal property, opened only when the entire tribe gathered for sacred ceremonies. The scent was so potent that centaurs could detect it from miles away, drawing them irresistibly to its source. Heracles, ignorant of what he had done, poured himself a generous cup and drank deeply. The wine was extraordinary, tasting of mountain herbs and honey, warming his throat like liquid sunlight. He had barely finished his cup when he heard the sound of hooves, many hooves, thundering towards the cave. The centaurs burst from the forest in a rage. There were dozens of them, perhaps 100, their eyes wild with fury. They had smelled their sacred wine being consumed by an outsider, a mortal who had no right to it.
"Thief!" they cried. "You dare to drink what Dionysus gave to us alone?"
Pholus rushed forward, trying to calm his kinsman. "Please, brothers, it was a mistake. Heracles did not know." But the centaurs were beyond reason. The scent of the opened wine had driven them into a frenzy. They charged at Heracles with rocks and broken branches, some wielding crude stone axes they used for hunting. Chiron, too, tried to restore order, placing himself between Heracles and the mob, but the wild centaurs shoved past him. Heracles had no choice but to defend himself. The first centaur to reach him swung a massive branch at his head. Heracles ducked and struck back with his club, sending the creature tumbling down the slope. More came at him from all sides. He fought with controlled strength at first, trying not to kill, but the centaur's fury was absolute. They would not stop until he was dead. Realizing the danger, Heracles reached for his bow and the arrows he had dipped in the Hydra's blood. He began shooting, each arrow finding its mark. The slightest scratch from these poisoned arrows meant instant death. Centaurs fell one after another, their bodies convulsing as the venom spread through their veins. In the confusion of battle, with bodies pressing in from all sides, Heracles saw another figure moving through the chaos. He drew and fired in one smooth motion. The arrow struck, and immediately a different cry went up, not the wild rage of the attacking centaurs, but a sound of pure agony that cut through everything else. The remaining centaurs heard that cry and fled in terror, galloping into the darkness of the forest. As the area around the cave entrance cleared, Heracles approached the fallen figure. When he saw who it was, his bow fell from his hand. There on the ground lay Chiron, his beloved teacher, the one who had taught him archery when he was just a boy. The poisoned arrow protruded from his knee. Chiron writhed in agony as the Hydra's poison burned through his immortal body. Because he could not die, the venom would torture him forever, each moment bringing fresh waves of unbearable pain. His wise eyes, once so clear and knowing, were now clouded with suffering. Zeus, watching from Olympus, took pity on the noble centaur who had taught so many heroes. The king of the gods could not undo what had been done, but he could offer release. He drew Chiron's spirit from his tortured body and placed it among the stars, where it became the constellation Sagittarius, the archer, forever aiming his bow at the heavens. While Heracles knelt beside where Chiron had lain, Pholus examined the area in confusion. How had such small arrows killed such powerful creatures? He picked up one of the shafts from the ground, holding it up to study the dark stain on its point. His hands were slick with sweat from the battle, and as he turned the arrow to see it better, it slipped from his grasp. It fell, and the poisoned point struck his hoof, barely breaking the skin. The scratch was so small he hardly felt it. But Hydra's venom worked quickly. Pholus looked down at the tiny wound, then up at Heracles, who was still kneeling beside Chiron. Understanding filled his eyes. The poison was already spreading through his veins. His legs gave way. Before Heracles could turn around, before anyone could help, Pholus was dead. In a single evening, through his carelessness with the wine and his poisoned arrows, he had killed both his teacher and his friend. The hero who had strangled serpents as an infant, who had defeated the Nemean lion and the Hydra, fell to his knees and wept. He buried Pholus with his own hands, digging the grave deep and marking it with a pile of stones. As he said the funeral rites, he noticed movement in the forest. One centaur watched from the shadows, having survived the massacre by hiding among the rocks. This was Nessus, younger and cleverer than the others. He stared at Heracles with eyes full of hatred, memorizing every detail of the hero's face. Then he vanished into the mountains, where he would spend years nursing his desire for revenge. With a heavy heart, Heracles finally continued to Mount Erymanthus to complete his actual labour. He found the boar easily enough, its tracks clear in the mud near a mountain spring. The beast was enormous, covered in bristling black hair, its tusks yellow and sharp. But after the tragedy with the centaurs, capturing it seemed almost trivial. Heracles chased the boar up the mountain slopes until deep snow slowed its charge. The creature struggled through the drifts, exhausting itself, until Heracles could approach safely. He bound it with heavy chains, wrapping them around its body and tusks so it could not gore him, then hoisted the massive animal onto his shoulders. When Heracles arrived at Mycenae with the giant boar still alive and furious, he carried it directly to the throne room. The moment Eurystheus saw the monster, he shrieked in terror and abandoned his throne. Scrambling across the room, the king dove headfirst into a large bronze storage jar, desperately pulling the lid down to hide himself. "Take it away!" came Eurystheus's muffled voice from inside the jar. "Remove that beast at once!" Heracles stood there for a moment, the boar still thrashing on his shoulders, watching the jar shake as the king cowered inside. Despite his grief over Pholus and Chiron, he could not entirely suppress a smile at the ridiculous sight. He carried the boar outside and released it to run back to its mountain home. Only after Heracles confirmed the creature was gone did Eurystheus finally emerge, his face flushed with embarrassment and his royal robes crumpled. Without meeting Heracles' eyes, he quickly assigned the fifth labour and dismissed him from the throne room. Labour 5. The Augean Stables. For his fifth labour, Heracles was tasked to clean the Augean stables in a single day, using only his hands and without any assistance. When Eurystheus announced this task, he could not hide his satisfaction. This was not a monster to slay or a divine creature to capture, but a degrading, impossible chore. Sending Heracles on his way, Eurystheus was certain that failure awaited him, certain that the humiliation of wallowing in filth would break his spirit. The stables belonged to King Augeas of Elis, a kingdom that lay west of Mycenae, beyond the mountains. Augeas was the son of Helios, the sun god, and his divine heritage had brought him some strange blessings. Chief among these was a herd of 3,000 cattle that could not die. These immortal beasts had been a gift from his father, meant to ensure the kingdom's prosperity. But immortal cattle produced very mortal waste, and therein lay the problem. For 30 years no one had cleaned the stables. At first it had been simple neglect. Then, as the dung piled higher, it became difficult. Eventually it became impossible. The filth had accumulated until in some places it reached the height of 2 men standing on each other's shoulders. The stench was so overwhelming that birds flying overhead would fall from the sky, overcome by the fumes. No servant, no slave, no amount of gold could convince anyone to enter those buildings. Worse still, the dung had overflowed from the stables themselves, spreading across the surrounding countryside like a plague of filth. What had once been fertile farmland was now buried beneath a crust of hardened manure so thick that ploughs broke against it. The kingdom that should have been the richest in Greece, blessed with immortal cattle, was instead slowly starving as its fields lay useless. Heracles arrived in Elis on a clear morning, walking through the city gates with his lion-skin cloak and massive club. Word of his labours had spread throughout Greece. He had slain the Nemean lion, destroyed the Hydra, captured the golden Hind, and defeated the Erymanthian Boar. The citizens of Elis gathered in the streets to see this famous hero, their faces bright with hope. When Heracles announced he had come to clean the Augean stables, the crowd fell silent, then erupted in excitement. An old farmer pushed through the crowd, his face weathered from years of trying to work the ruined land. "If you can truly accomplish this," he said, "you should seek payment from King Eurystheus. Our kingdom has suffered for 30 years. Such a service deserves reward." Heracles had not thought of payment. His labours were meant to be completed without reward, as penance for his crimes. But the people of Elis had suffered through no fault of their own, and their enthusiasm moved him. Perhaps there was no harm in asking. King Eurystheus received Heracles in his great hall, a space that had once been magnificent, but now showed signs of his kingdom's decline. The tapestries were faded, the gold leaf peeling from the columns. The king himself was a large man, with the golden eyes of his father Helios, but there was a shrewdness in his gaze that spoke of too many years counting coins while his people suffered.
"So, the mighty Heracles comes to clean my stables," Augean said. "Eurystheus must take great pleasure in sending you to perform such work."
"I come to complete my task," Heracles replied. "Your people believe it deserves payment." Augean studied him for a moment.
"If you can clean my stables completely before sunset today, using only your hands, I will give you 1/10 of my immortal herd, 300 cattle that cannot die." His smile showed he believed this impossible. "But if you fail, you will announce throughout Greece that King Augean set a task that defeated Heracles."
"I accept these terms," Heracles said. The king turned to his eldest son, Phyleus, a young man who had his grandfather's golden eyes, but a kinder face than his father.
"Go with him, my son. Witness his attempt, so none can say we cheated the great hero when he fails."
Phyleus led Heracles through the city towards the stables, and long before they reached them, the smell announced their presence. 30 years of decay and fermentation had created a stench beyond description. Phyleus covered his nose with his cloak, but Heracles continued forward, his eyes streaming from the fumes. The stables were enormous, a series of buildings that stretched for the length of the city itself. They had been built in the early days of the kingdom, when the immortal cattle first arrived, and were still considered a blessing rather than a curse. Now they looked like monuments to neglect. The doors had long since rotted away, and through the openings Heracles could see the mountains of dung, packed so solid in some places that it had become almost like rock. Standing before this impossible task, Heracles felt something he had not experienced in his previous labours: doubt. He could not strangle this problem or shoot it with arrows. He could not chase it for a year or wrestle it into submission. For a moment he stood there, his great strength useless against mountains of filth. Then he turned and looked at the landscape surrounding the stables. To the north and south, 2 rivers flowed down from the mountains, the Alpheus and the Peneus. They ran strong and clear, fed by mountain snows, passing within a few hundred yards of the stables before continuing to the sea. Heracles studied their course, the lay of the land, the slope from the rivers to the buildings. A plan began to form in his mind. Phyleus watched as Heracles walked to a spot between the rivers and the stables, then knelt and began to dig. He clawed at the earth with his bare hands, tearing through soil and clay, ripping out rocks that would have required whole teams of workers to shift. The young prince stood amazed as Heracles worked with incredible speed, carving a channel from the nearer river towards the stables. For hours, Heracles dug, his hands bloody from the stones, his muscles straining with constant effort. The channel grew deeper and wider, cutting a straight path across the fields. When it reached the stables, he dug another channel out the far side, directing it towards the second river. By afternoon, he had created a system that would divert both rivers through the buildings. All that remained was to break through the final barriers of earth that held the rivers back. Heracles stood at the first dam of soil and stones he had left in place. With a mighty heave, he tore it open. The Alpheus River, suddenly given a new path, roared into the channel. Then he ran to the second dam and broke it as well, adding the waters of the Peneus to the torrent. The water rushed into the stables with tremendous force. The sound filled the valley as 30 years of accumulated filth met the combined power of two rivers. The compacted dung, hardened over decades, began to break apart under the relentless current. Within moments, the torrent was carrying away mountains of waste, the water running black as it poured through the buildings. What would have taken 1,000 men months to clear was being swept away in hours. But the water did not stop at simply cleaning the stables. As it flowed out the other side, it spread across the buried farmland, the force of its passage breaking up the hardened crust of manure that had made the fields useless. The water carried this fertilizer across the entire valley, depositing it in a thin, rich layer that would make the soil more fertile than it had ever been. Within hours, the stables were clean, their stone floors visible for the first time in a generation. The rivers, having done their work, were redirected back to their original courses when Heracles filled in strategic parts of his channels. The impossible task was complete, and the sun had not yet set. The people of Elis poured out of the city, hardly believing what they saw. The stables stood clean, the air already beginning to clear. More importantly, their fields were free, the soil dark and rich, ready for planting. They surrounded Heracles, some grasping his hands in gratitude, others falling to their knees in thanks. Old farmers wept openly at the sight of their restored lands. But in his palace, King Augean was furious. He had never expected to lose 300 immortal cattle. When Heracles came to collect his payment, the king refused.
"The rivers did the work," Augean declared. "Not you. The gods of the waters cleaned my stables."
"I dug the channels with my own hands," Heracles said, showing his bloodied fingers. "I used no tools. No man helped me."
"It was still trickery," the king said. "I will not pay."
Heracles' first instinct was to strike the king down, but Phyleus stepped forward. "Father, this is not just. Heracles completed the task, as you agreed. I saw everything."
"Then you are blind,"
Augean said coldly. Heracles proposed that they let the leading citizens of Elis judge the matter. A trial was convened in the city's forum, with dozens of citizens serving as jury. They had all seen what Heracles had done, how he had freed their lands from 30 years of accumulated filth. Phyleus testified before them all. "My father agreed to the bargain. Heracles used only his hands. The task was completed before sunset. The agreement should be honored." King Augean rose from his seat, his face dark with rage.
"My own son testifies against me? Then I make this decree. Heracles is banished from Elis, and you, Phyleus, you share his fate. Leave this kingdom and never return."
The citizens gasped at this injustice, but none dared oppose their king. Heracles and Phyleus left the city together, the young prince now exiled for speaking the truth. "Forgive me," Phyleus said as they walked. "I could not stand silent while injustice was done."
"The shame belongs to your father, not to you," Heracles replied. "This day you proved yourself the better man." They parted ways at the border of Elis, Phyleus heading to seek refuge with relatives, Heracles returning to Mycenae, but the hero made a silent promise that day. When his labours were complete, when he was free of his servitude to Eurystheus, he would return to Elis. Years later, when that day finally came, Heracles would fulfill his oath, returning to Elis with an army. True to his word, he would kill King Augean in battle and place Phyleus on the throne as the rightful king. To celebrate this victory and the cleansing of corruption from Elis, Heracles would establish a great festival of athletic competitions held every 4 years. These would become the Olympic Games, a celebration that would last for over 1,000 years, far outliving any of the kings who had tried to cheat him. However, this was still far in the future. For now, with his 5th labour complete, Heracles began the long road back to Mycenae, his mood dark despite completing the impossible task. He had been cheated by King Augean, denied the payment he had earned, and banished from a kingdom he had just saved. But he was bound by divine law to complete his service to Eurystheus, and so he returned to receive his next command. Unknown to Heracles as he travelled, Eurystheus had already heard the full story through his network of messengers, and the cowardly king could hardly contain his glee. Not only had Heracles sought payment from Augean, bargaining for a portion of the immortal herd, but he had also allowed the rivers to do the work for him. The terms of the labours were clear. They must be completed without reward, as penance for his crimes, and Heracles himself must accomplish each task. Since both conditions had been violated, this labour would not count towards the 10, though Eurystheus decided to keep this decision to himself for now, savouring the knowledge that Heracles believed himself closer to freedom than he truly was. Labour 6. The Stymphalian Birds. For his 6th labour, Heracles was commanded to drive away the man-eating birds that had claimed Lake Stymphalus as their home. Sacred creatures of the war god Ares, each stood as tall as a crane, covered in feathers of sharpened brass that they could launch at their prey like a volley of arrows. Their beaks were forged from iron, capable of piercing straight through bronze armour, and their droppings were so toxic that they poisoned the soil itself, withering crops and fouling wells, until the land around the lake had become a barren wasteland. The journey to Lake Stymphalus took Heracles through the mountains of Arcadia, following paths that grew increasingly desolate as he approached. Where once there had been shepherds tending flocks, now there were only abandoned huts with their roofs caved in. The grass grew yellow and sickly, then disappeared entirely, leaving only bare rock and dead soil. Even before he could see the lake, Heracles could smell it, a sharp, burning smell from the birds' poison mixing with the rot of the marsh. When Heracles reached the top of the final hill and looked down upon Lake Stymphalus, he understood the true challenge of this labour. The lake stretched for miles below him, its waters completely hidden beneath a sea of reeds and marsh grass. The vegetation had grown into an impenetrable wall, making it impossible to find anything within. Beneath the surface lay a maze of tangled roots and deep mud that could trap a man up to his waist. Somewhere in this vast swamp, thousands of deadly birds remained concealed in the dense growth, completely invisible from shore. Standing at the lake's edge, Heracles could hear the birds calling to each other from deep within the marsh, their cries harsh and metallic, but he could see none of them. The swamp was their perfect refuge.
Even if he waded in and managed to kill a dozen birds each day, it would take him more than a year to hunt them all. The terms of his service allowed him only 10 years for all his labours combined. Time was a luxury he could not afford. For 3 days Heracles circled the lake, searching for a solution. He tried wading into the marsh, but the ground gave way beneath his feet. He attempted to set fire to the dry grass at the water's edge, but the vegetation was too damp to burn properly. Each night he could hear the birds moving in the darkness, their iron beaks clicking together in an endless, menacing rhythm. Unknown to Heracles, his struggles were being observed from Mount Olympus. Zeus watched his son's frustration with growing concern. The king of the gods could not intervene directly, for Hera's eyes were always upon him, watching for any sign of favoritism towards his illegitimate son. But Zeus was not without allies among the immortals. He turned to Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, who had her own reasons to despise Hera's cruelty. "My daughter," Zeus said quietly, ensuring that Hera could not hear, "perhaps you might take an interest in the situation at Lake Stymphalian. The birds there are sacred to Ares, after all, and you have always enjoyed frustrating your brother." Athena understood immediately. On the 4th morning, as Heracles stood surveying the marsh, he heard a strange sound behind him, the clear ringing of metal striking metal. He spun around to see a tall figure in a grey cloak disappearing between the trees. Where the figure had stood, something bronze lay against the moss. Heracles approached and found a pair of bronze rattles resting on the moss-covered trunk of a fallen willow. They were unlike anything mortal smiths could create, covered in engravings that seemed to shift as he looked at them. The metal was warm to the touch, as if fresh from Hephaestus's forge. Heracles lifted them carefully, understanding that divine aid had been given. "Thank you, wise Athena," he said aloud to the empty forest. Carrying the rattles, Heracles climbed the highest hill overlooking the marsh. From this vantage point he could see the full expanse of the lake, though the birds remained hidden. He raised the rattles above his head and began to shake them vigorously. To his own ears the sound was loud but bearable, like shields clashing in battle, but to the birds of Ares, bred for war and attuned to different frequencies, the sound was agony. The effect was immediate. The entire marsh erupted as thousands of birds burst from their hiding places, rising into the air with terrible shrieks. Their cries were so loud that rocks cracked on the distant mountains. The sky darkened as they formed a massive flock, wheeling in confusion, desperate to escape the unbearable noise of the rattles. This was the moment Heracles had been waiting for. Setting down the rattles, he took up his bow and began to fire his poisoned arrows at the sky. His arms moved in perfect rhythm, draw and release, arrow after arrow finding its mark. Dead birds plummeted into the waters below, their bodies striking the surface with heavy splashes. Those that survived the barrage fled northward in terror, their cries growing fainter as they disappeared over the mountains. They would never return to Lake Stymphalian. Within an hour, the lake that had been plagued for generations stood quiet and still, its waters littered with brass feathers that would later be collected by the local people as proof of the monster's defeat. Heracles descended from his hill, the divine rattles wrapped carefully in his cloak. The 6th labour was complete, and this time he had succeeded without bargaining for payment or accepting help from any mortal. As he began the journey back to Mycenae, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Surely even Eurystheus could find no fault with this victory. Labour 7. The Cretan Bull. When Heracles returned from Lake Stymphalian with news of his success, He found King Eurystheus in a state of barely concealed panic. The cowardly king had spent days searching through old scrolls and consulting his advisors, desperately seeking another impossible task. But he had exhausted every monster, every cursed location, every deadly creature within his own kingdom and the neighbouring territories.
"So, cousin,"
Eurystheus said, his voice strained with frustration,
"you return victorious once more."
"The labour is complete," Heracles replied simply, standing before the throne with the divine rattles still wrapped in his cloak as proof. Eurystheus drummed his fingers on the arm of his throne, his narrow shoulders tense beneath his purple robes. He had sent Heracles to face lions, serpents, sacred deer, savage boars, filth, and man-eating birds. Each time he had expected to receive news of his cousin's death. Each time Heracles had returned stronger than before.
"Your next labour,"
the king began, then paused, his jaw working as if the words were bitter on his tongue.
"Your next labour will take you beyond my kingdom. You will sail to Crete, where King Minos rules. He has a task that requires your particular talents."
Heracles raised an eyebrow. Eurystheus was passing the responsibility to another king, unwilling or unable to devise a task himself.
"King Minos has already agreed to set your task,"
Eurystheus continued quickly, seeing his cousin's surprise.
"You will obey his commands as you would mine. Now go. The ship departs from Nauplia at dawn."
The voyage to Crete took 3 days across choppy spring waters. Heracles stood at the bow of the merchant vessel, dolphins racing alongside the hull as he considered what awaited him on the island. Crete was the most powerful island in the Mediterranean, its navy controlling the trade routes, its palace at Knossos said to be the grandest in all the world. King Minos was known as a hard but fair ruler, though strange stories had emerged from the island in recent years, whispers of a monster beneath the palace, and a tribute of young Athenians fed to it every 7 years. When Heracles arrived at Knossos, he was struck by the palace's magnificence. The buildings seemed to sprawl forever, their walls painted with elaborate frescoes of octopuses and bull leapers. Servants led him through courtyard after courtyard, past rooms filled with massive storage jars of grain and oil, through corridors decorated with double-headed axes, the symbol of Minoan power. The palace was less a single building than a small city, its passages so complex that Heracles wondered if he could find his way out without a guide. King Minos received him in a vast chamber that made Eurystheus's hall pale in comparison. The ceiling rose 3 stories high, supported by blood-red columns that tapered at the bottom in the Minoan style. The king himself was an imposing figure, his black beard oiled and curled. His sharp, intelligent gaze reminded Heracles that this man was also a son of Zeus, his own half-brother.
"Heracles,"
Minos said, his voice echoing in the vast space,
"I have heard of your labours. Today you will face something born from the gods' own fury."
The king rose from his throne and walked to a balcony that overlooked the city. Heracles followed, and in the distance he could see smoke rising from several fires. The sound of screaming drifted on the wind.
"Years ago,"
Minos began, his voice heavy with regret,
"Poseidon sent me a gift from the sea. A bull of pure white, more beautiful than any creature I had ever seen. Its hide shone like polished ivory, its horns were perfectly curved, and it moved with a strange grace that seemed almost divine. Poseidon expected me to sacrifice this bull in his honor, to show my gratitude for his blessing."
Minos gripped the balcony railing, his hands tightening on the stone.
"But I was a fool. I could not bring myself to kill something so perfect. I sacrificed another bull instead, a common brown beast from my own herds, thinking Poseidon would not notice or would not care."
The king turned to face Heracles.
Poseidon punished me for my deception. He cursed my wife, Pasiphae, to fall in love with the bull. The passion consumed her beyond all reason. She commissioned the craftsman Daedalus to build her a hollow wooden cow covered in hide, so that she could— He paused for a moment, his throat tightening. Mate with the creature. Heracles remained silent, though he had heard rumours of this story. The tale was whispered in every port in Greece, though none dared speak it openly. From that unnatural union, Minos continued, came an abomination. A child with the head of a bull and the body of a man, the Minotaur. I have imprisoned it in a labyrinth beneath the palace, where Daedalus built passages so confusing that even he cannot navigate them without a thread to guide him back. Every 7 years, Athens sends 7 young men and 7 maidens to feed the creature, payment for their defeat in war. Another scream echoed from the city below, closer this time. But that is not your concern, Minos said. After my wife's curse was fulfilled, Poseidon's anger turned to the bull itself. He drove it mad. For months now it has rampaged across my island. It destroys crops, tramples vineyards, and gores anyone foolish enough to approach. My soldiers cannot stop it. Their spears bounce off its hide as if the god himself protects it. 20 of my best warriors lie dead, their bodies scattered across the island. Minos looked directly at Heracles. Capture this bull alive and remove it from my island. I care not where you take it, only that Crete is freed from its destruction. Heracles left the palace that same day, armed with only his club and the knowledge that this creature had killed 20 of Minos's finest warriors. The servants who guided him out of the complex palace spoke in hushed tones of crushed homes and ruined harvests, of families sleeping in caves to escape the bull's wrath. Following reports of the bull's latest rampage, Heracles travelled towards the interior of the island, passing through settlements where people barricaded themselves behind doors at the first sign of dust on the horizon. 3 days later, following the bull's trail of destruction, Heracles reached the plains near Archanes. The path the bull had taken was easy to follow. A wide swath of ruined farmland cut across the landscape. Where vineyards had once grown in neat rows, now there were only broken stakes and trampled vines. Stone walls that had stood for generations lay scattered in pieces. He found the bull standing among the wreckage of what had been an olive grove. The creature was enormous, larger than any bull bred by man. Its shoulders stood higher than Heracles could reach, and its horns swept outward in deadly arcs. The famous white hide that had captivated King Minos was now caked with dirt and blood from its rampage. Every few moments it would bellow and charge at nothing, tearing up the earth with its hooves, lost in Poseidon's curse. When the bull spotted Heracles approaching across the ruined field, it lowered its head and charged. The ground trembled under its weight as it built speed, bellowing in rage. This was not like wrestling the Nemean lion, which had fought with intelligence and cunning. The bull simply came straight at him with all the force Poseidon's madness could give it. At the last moment, Heracles sidestepped and grabbed the bull's horns as it passed, using its own momentum to swing himself onto its enormous back. The bull bucked and twisted, trying to throw him off, but Heracles locked his legs around its body and held on with all his strength. The bull ran in circles, crashed through the remains of stone walls, and rolled on the ground, but Heracles would not let go. For hours the battle continued, the bull's divine nature giving it stamina beyond any mortal creature. Gradually the bull's struggles grew weaker, its mad charges became stumbling walks. Finally, as the sun began to set over the western mountains, the great beast fell to its knees, its sides heaving with exhaustion, foam dripping from its mouth.
Heracles maintained his grip on the horns, but eased the pressure, speaking softly to the creature in the voice he had once used with horses in his youth. Whether it was exhaustion or some recognition of a stronger will, the bull's madness seemed to break. The red faded from its eyes, and it stood quietly, trembling but subdued. But now the question remained of how to return the bull to Mycenae. No ship's captain would take such a creature aboard, subdued or not. As Heracles led the exhausted bull towards the coast, he considered his options. Then he recalled what Minos had said. This was Poseidon's bull, a creature born from the sea itself. Perhaps it still carried some of the sea god's power. At the harbour below Knossos, Heracles led the bull past scattered crates and overturned barrels, the dock workers having fled at first sight of the beast. He guided it to the end of the longest pier, where the Mediterranean stretched endlessly towards the homeland he had just left days before. The bull stood at the edge, snorting at the salt air. Without hesitation, Heracles vaulted onto its back and urged it forward with a squeeze of his legs. The bull took one step off the pier, then another, and instead of plunging into the waves, its hooves found solid footing on the water's surface as if the sea had become a road. The bull strode across the Mediterranean, with Heracles gripping its horns, each step sending small sprays of seawater into the air. They moved north through the afternoon, passing merchant vessels whose crews stood frozen at the rails, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Dolphins raced alongside them for miles, leaping and diving as if celebrating this impossible sight. The journey that took 3 days by ship took only 1 by bull. As they approached the coast of the Peloponnese, the bull waded through the shallows and onto the beach near Tiryns, its power to walk on water ending the moment it touched soil again. Heracles rode the bull directly to Mycenae, entering the city gates as the sun reached its peak. He guided the creature through the streets and into the palace courtyard, where the sound of its gigantic hooves clattering on the stone floor brought Eurystheus from his chambers. The king took one look at the massive white bull, its horns still bearing gouges from where Heracles had gripped them during their struggle, and immediately retreated to his storage jar, diving inside and pulling the lid down over his head. "Take it away!" came his muffled voice. "Get that monster out of my palace!" Heracles led the bull back out through the city gates, remembering that this creature was sacred to Poseidon despite its madness. Once they were beyond the walls, he released his grip on its horns and stepped back. The bull stood still for a moment, then suddenly bellowed and charged off into the countryside, the divine madness still burning in its eyes. In the years to come, it would rampage across the Greek mainland, terrorizing farmers and destroying crops, though never matching the destruction it had caused on Crete. Eventually the hero Theseus would encounter it near Marathon and bring its story to an end. As Heracles watched the white bull become a pale speck in the distant hills, he wondered what impossible task his cowardly cousin would devise next. 7 labours were complete, or so he believed, with only 3 remaining. He turned and walked back through the gates of Mycenae, ready to receive his next labour. Labour 8. The Mares of Diomedes. For his 8th labour, Heracles was commanded to bring back the mares of King Diomedes of Thrace. When Eurystheus announced this task, he did so with particular relish, knowing the reputation of these horses. Far from ordinary steeds, these were creatures of nightmare, known to breathe fire from their nostrils when enraged. Their savagery had been cultivated by their master, who fed them the flesh of unsuspecting guests and travellers who sought hospitality at his palace. The horses had developed such a taste for human meat that they would accept no other food, and their madness grew with each feeding. The journey to Thrace took Heracles far to the north, beyond the civilized lands of Greece into territories where barbarianism still reigned. For his labour, Heracles chose not to travel alone. He brought with him Abderus, the 20-year-old son of Hermes, who had become his companion and lover in recent months. The youth was lean and quick like his divine father, with a ready laugh that could lift Heracles' spirits even after the worst of his tasks. When Heracles had announced his journey to Thrace, Abderus immediately declared he would come along, refusing all arguments against it. He wanted to see the famous hero at work, to be part of one of the great labours that all of Greece spoke about. They travelled for 2 weeks through increasingly wild country. The well-maintained roads of Greece gave way to rough tracks through dark forests, where wolves howled at night. The further north they went, the colder it became, until they could see their breath in the morning air despite it being early summer. The Thracians they encountered along the way were a rough people, dressed in animal skins and speaking Greek with harsh accents. When Heracles asked about King Diomedes, they would make signs against evil and hurry away. "They fear him more than they fear you," Abderus observed, as yet another farmer refused to speak with them. "With good reason," Heracles replied, counting the barricaded windows and the makeshift weapons leaning beside every door. The palace of Diomedes sat on a hill overlooking the Bostonian lake, a structure more fortress than royal residence. Its walls were built from black stone, quarried from the nearby mountains, and iron spikes lined the ramparts. As they climbed the path towards the gates, they could hear the horses before they saw them. The sound they produced was like something between a scream and a roar, punctuated by the rattle of chains. The mares were kept in an open courtyard just inside the palace gates, displayed like mad trophies for all visitors to see. 4 horses stood chained to the walls, each more terrible than the last, their coats matted with dried blood. They thrashed without pause, foam dripping from their mouths, their metal shoes wearing grooves into the stone beneath them. Massive iron chains bound them to rings set deep in the palace walls, though even these bore scratches and dents from the horses' constant attempts to break free. But it was what lay beside them that made Abderus step back in horror. A wooden trough, the kind used to feed normal horses hay or oats, was filled with human remains. Arms and legs protruded from the pile, and the metallic smell of blood hung heavy in the air. One of the mares noticed their approach and lunged towards them, its chain snapping taut just feet from where they stood. Fire flickered briefly from its nostrils, and Heracles pulled Abderus back from the heat. "I should wait here," Abderus said, his voice unsteady. The young man had seen death before, travelling with Heracles, but this deliberate cruelty shook him. "Someone should keep watch while you negotiate with the king." Heracles wanted to insist that Abderus come inside, away from the mares, but the young man stood firm. "Stay well clear of their chains," he warned, patting Abderus's shoulder before entering the palace. The great hall of Diomedes was a reflection of its master's madness. Bones decorated the walls, not all of them from animals. The king himself sat on a throne made from yellowed tusks and antlers, a crown of iron on his head. He was a large man, soft from years of excess, though his thick arms still showed considerable strength. His beard was unkempt and greasy, his robes filthy with old stains, but it was his eyes that revealed his true nature. They darted constantly, never focusing on one thing, the eyes of a man whose mind had broken long ago.
"Heracles,"
Diomedes said, his voice rough and slurred,
"the famous hero comes to my kingdom. Have you come to admire my beauties?"
As he spoke, the king raised his hands to gesture, and Heracles saw the dried blood caked beneath his fingernails, fragments of flesh still lodged there from personally feeding his mares. The stench that emanated from him was overwhelming, a mixture of rotting meat and human filth that made even Heracles, who had cleaned the Augean stables, want to step back. "I have come for your horses," Heracles said directly, "by order of King Eurystheus." Diomedes laughed, a sound like grinding stones.
"My mares are not for sale or trade. They are my children, my beautiful daughters. Would you like to meet them more closely? Many visitors have had that honor."
Before Heracles could respond, a scream cut through the air from outside. It was not the cry of the horses, but something far worse, a human voice screaming in pure agony. Heracles recognized it immediately. Abderus. He ran from the hall, shoving past the guards who tried to block his way. In the courtyard he saw a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Abderus lay on the ground near the mares, his body already torn beyond recognition. In his curiosity, he had stepped too close to observe the creatures, not realizing that the chains had enough slack for the horses to reach him. They had pulled him down and were now fighting over his remains, their muzzles red with blood.
"No!"
Heracles roared, but it was already too late. The boy was gone, his soul already departing for Hades. Behind him, Diomedes laughed from the doorway.
"Your pretty boy makes a fine meal for my beauties. Young flesh is always the most tender."
Something broke inside Heracles at those words. The rage that had once led him to kill his own family in madness now returned, but this time cold and purposeful. He turned and crossed the courtyard in seconds. The guards moved to stop him, but he broke the first one's neck with a single blow and threw the second into the wall with such force that the man's skull cracked against the stone. Diomedes tried to run, but Heracles caught him by his greasy hair and dragged him towards the mares. The king screamed and begged, his madness replaced by terror as he realized what was about to happen.
"You fed them human flesh," Heracles said, his voice deadly quiet. "Let us see how they enjoy the taste of their master." He threw Diomedes to his own mares. The horses fell upon him immediately, tearing into their master with a terrible hunger. But as they consumed his flesh, something unexpected happened. The meat was so foul, so corrupted by years of evil, that even these man-eating horses began to recoil. After consuming half of their master, they suddenly stopped and stepped back from what remained. The disgusting taste of his flesh had cured them forever of their appetite for human meat. With the horses now docile, Heracles was able to unchain them from the wall, but before leaving Thrace, there was a duty he had to perform. He gathered what remained of Abderus, wrapping the body carefully in his own cloak. Finding a peaceful spot overlooking the Bostonian lake, far from the cursed palace, Heracles dug a proper tomb with his own hands. He wept as he worked, the hero who had faced monsters without flinching, now broken by grief. Into the tomb he placed not just Abderus's body, but also a ceremonial bowl inscribed with words of love and devotion. When the burial was complete, Heracles made a vow. Here, where his beloved lay, he would found a city in Abderus's name. In years to come, the city of Abdera would rise on this spot, and athletic games would be held every year in the young man's honor, boxing, wrestling, and pankration, the fierce combination of both sports that would one day be called mixed combat, but never chariot races, for it was curiosity about horses that had led to his death. Only after these rites were complete did Heracles take up the chains of the now gentle mares and begin the long journey back to Mycenae. The horses followed him meekly, ordinary animals once more, their madness cured by the foul taste of their evil master's flesh. The journey back to Mycenae was one of the longest Heracles had ever undertaken, not in distance, but in the weight of his grief.
When he finally arrived and presented the now gentle mares to Eurystheus, the king was disappointed by their passivity.
"These are not the fire-breathing monsters I was promised,"
Eurystheus complained, but he kept them anyway, adding them to his royal stables, where they lived out their days eating hay and oats, just like other ordinary horses. Standing in the courtyard after delivering the mares, Heracles thought not of his completed labour, but of Abderus, whose laughter he would never hear again. 8 labours were complete, but the price of this one would stay with him forever. Labour 9. The Girdle of Hippolyta. For his 9th labour, Heracles received an unusual command. This time the task came not from King Eurystheus himself, but from his daughter, Admete, a young woman of 16 who spent her days dreaming of distant lands and legendary warriors. For weeks she had been working on her father, bringing up the Amazons at every meal. That morning she had found him in his hall, reviewing reports from his tax collectors, and seized her chance. "Father," she said, standing straight before his throne, "I have thought of the perfect labour for your cousin." Eurystheus looked up from his scrolls, already weary. His daughter's fascinations rarely ended well. "What now, Admete?" "The girdle of Hippolyta, the golden war belt of the Amazon queen." "The Amazons?" Eurystheus set down the papyrus he had been reading, his interest suddenly sharp. "Why would you want such a thing?" "It is a trophy no other woman possesses," Admete replied, her chin raised. "Imagine the envy of every princess in Greece when they learn I own the war belt of the Amazon queen herself." Eurystheus leaned back in his throne, a slow smile spreading across his face. The Amazons were legendary fighters who lived beyond the Black Sea, at the very edge of the known world, a nation of women who had built their society without men. From childhood they trained in the arts of war, and their ferocity was such that no Greek army had ever defeated them in battle. Their queen, Hippolyta, was said to be the daughter of Ares himself. The god of war had gifted her a magnificent girdle made of golden leather, which not only marked her as queen, but, according to legend, ensured she could never fall in battle. To retrieve such an item, Heracles would have to sail beyond the edge of civilization and face an army of women who had never known defeat. Even if he somehow obtained the girdle, the Amazons would surely hunt him down. It was perfect. "Very well," Eurystheus said, trying to keep the eagerness from his voice. "I shall send him for your prize." That afternoon, Heracles was summoned to the throne room. He entered, still sweating from the practice grounds, where he had been training to maintain his strength between labours. Eurystheus barely looked at him as he delivered the command. "Your 9th labour," the king announced, "is to retrieve the girdle belonging to Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. My daughter desires it." Heracles frowned. He had expected another monster to slay, another impossible creature to capture, not this. "The Amazons are beyond the Black Sea," he said. "It will take months." "Then you had best start preparing for your journey," Eurystheus replied, dismissing him with a wave. For this labour, Heracles knew he would need a ship and men to sail it. No one could reach those distant lands alone. He gathered 30 volunteers from Tiryns and Mycenae, warriors who had fought beside him in earlier campaigns. When they assembled at the harbour, Heracles told them plainly what they faced: the Amazons, daughters of war itself. Together they sailed east across the familiar waters of the Augean, then through the narrow passage of the Hellespont, where Europe nearly touches Asia. The men grew quieter as they passed through those straits, knowing that each stroke of the oars carried them beyond the world they knew. The Black Sea proved treacherous. Storms killed 2 men and drove them far off course. By the time they reached the mouth of the Thermodon River weeks later, the survivors were worn thin, knowing they stood further from home than any Greek ought to be. Heracles expected immediate hostility when they landed in Amazon territory. The Amazons' reputation suggested they would attack any male intruders on sight. Instead, as they pulled their vessel onto the beach, they were met by a delegation of women on horseback, armed but not threatening. "We know who you are, Heracles," their leader said in accented but clear Greek. "Our queen wishes to meet the man whose labours are spoken of even here at the edge of the world. You and your men are welcome as guests." Heracles and his men were led through streets unlike any they had known. Themyscira, the Amazon capital, had no monuments to male gods, no statues of kings or heroes. Instead, shrines to Artemis and Athena rose from every corner. From nearby training grounds came the constant sound of weapons meeting, where girls, no older than 10, practiced combat drills with the same intensity as any Spartan boy. The Greek warriors walked close together, unsure what to make of this reversed world. Some watched the training with professional interest, noting techniques they had never seen. Others seemed uncomfortable seeing women in armour, muttering prayers under their breath. But as the day wore on and no attack came, as Amazon guards brought them bread and wine without hostility, the tension in their shoulders began to ease. The visitors were given quarters in a stone building near the palace, comfortable enough, though guards stood at every door. His men gathered in the courtyard of their lodgings. "Perhaps the stories were wrong," one said, tearing into roasted meat the Amazons had provided. "They seem civilized enough." "Better fed than we've been in weeks," another agreed, refilling his cup with a strong local wine. An older warrior warned them to stay alert, but even he relaxed as the evening deepened and the wine flowed. By the time they sought their beds, most were thinking only of completing this peaceful labour and returning home. That evening, a warrior came for Heracles alone. She led him through torchlit corridors to the Queen's Hall, a long room with weapons lining every wall, spears, swords, and axes by the hundreds. At the far end, beside a roaring fire, sat Queen Hippolyta. She was nothing like he had imagined. Heracles had expected someone scarred and weathered by constant warfare, harsh and unforgiving. Instead, standing before him was a beautiful woman of perhaps 30 years, her skin unmarked by battle, her movements graceful rather than harsh. She was tall and strong, but there was a composure about her that spoke of victories won through skill rather than savagery. The famous girdle wrapped around her waist, its golden leather catching the firelight. She studied him for a moment, then gestured to the place beside her at the feast table. "Come, sit with me," she said, dismissing her guards with a wave. "I would like to speak with you alone." When they were seated and wine had been poured, Hippolyta spoke first. "Your reputation precedes you, Heracles. Even here we have heard the tales, but stories grow in the telling." She paused, studying his face. "Is it true you wrestled the Nemean lion to death with nothing but your hands?" "It is," Heracles replied, "though it took most of a day, not the quick victory the songs describe." "The songs never mention the waiting or the fear," she said. "Only the victory." They talked through the evening as the fire burned lower. Heracles told her of the Hydra, how its blood still poisoned his arrows, of the golden hind he had chased for a full year without rest. Hippolyta spoke of her own battles, of holding the mountain passes against Persian armies, of breaking wild horses on the steppes. She asked about his training, his techniques. He asked about Amazon battle formations, their methods of teaching young warriors. As the night deepened, Heracles felt an unexpected connection growing between them. Here was someone who understood the burden of constant warfare, the weight of divine parentage, the loneliness of being stronger than everyone around you. When Hippolyta laughed at something he said, it was genuine, not the nervous laughter he usually heard from those who feared him. "There is something I must tell you," Heracles finally said as the fire burned low. "I did not come here simply as a visitor. My 9th labour requires me to bring back your girdle." Hippolyta's expression grew serious. "The gift from my father Ares? The symbol of my queenship?" Heracles nodded. "King Eurystheus's daughter desires it." For a long moment, Hippolyta was silent. Then, to Heracles' amazement, she smiled. "If you had come here with an army demanding it, we would have fought to the last woman. If you had tried to steal it, we would have hunted you across the world. But you came as a guest and told me the truth." She stood and unbuckled the girdle from her waist. "I give this to you freely, as a gift from one warrior to another." She placed the golden belt in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, the leather warm from her body. "Your labours will end," she said, "and when they do, perhaps you may visit us again." Heracles bowed his head, moved by her generosity. No words seemed adequate, so he simply met her gaze and nodded. They stood there for a moment longer, warrior to warrior, before Hippolyta rose and walked him to the door of her hall. "Rest well," she said. "Tomorrow I will show you our training grounds. Perhaps you could demonstrate that wrestling hold you used on the Nemean lion to our young fighters." She called for a servant. "Prepare the guest chamber in the east wing for Heracles. He will stay here tonight as my personal guest." Heracles hesitated. "My men will be perfectly safe in their quarters," Hippolyta assured him. "You have my word." The chamber she provided was finer than any he had slept in for many years. Heracles carefully wrapped the girdle in oiled cloth and placed it beneath his pillow. As he lay on the soft bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Amazon palace at night, he found himself thinking not of completing his labour, but of spending another day in this strange city where a woman could rule and warriors could speak as equals. For the first time in months, sleep came easily. From Mount Olympus, Hera watched this peaceful scene with rising fury. This was intolerable. Not only was Heracles about to complete another labour without bloodshed, but he was forming a connection with someone who might actually bring him happiness. The goddess descended to earth in the deep of night, taking the form of an Amazon warrior, one whose face was familiar but not memorable. She moved through the Amazon camp that night, stopping first at a watchfire near the harbour where 3 warriors stood guard. "Sisters," she said, her voice urgent but quiet, "I was bringing water to the Greeks' quarters when I heard them talking. They plan to take our queen at dawn." The guards turned sharply. "What did you hear?" the eldest asked. "Heracles was telling his men that once they have Hippolyta on their ship, all of Themyscira's treasures will be theirs. The girdle was just an excuse to get close to her." Hera let her voice crack as if holding back tears. "They laughed about how easy it was, how the queen suspected nothing." One guard spat in disgust. "I knew we should never trust outsiders." "Alert the others," the eldest guard commanded, quietly. "We strike before they can execute their plan." From there, the lie spread like poison through the ranks. Each Amazon who heard it felt personally betrayed. They had welcomed these men, shown them their city, and this was their repayment. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, every warrior in Themyscira had armed herself in silence, their horses saddled and ready. They would save their queen or die trying. Heracles woke to war cries spreading through the city. He grabbed the wrapped girdle from beneath his pillow and slung it across his shoulder in its cloth covering, then rushed from the guest chamber, still fastening his lion's skin. From a palace balcony he could see smoke rising from the direction of the harbour district where his men were quartered. The war cries grew louder, carrying on the morning wind. He raced through the palace and out the main gates, running through the still quiet streets of the upper city. As he reached the harbour quarter, the sounds of battle became deafening. When he finally reached his men's lodgings, he found chaos. His companions scattered in every direction, some still pulling on their armour, others stumbling half asleep from their beds. Amazon horsewomen had surrounded the building, driving spears through fleeing backs. Arrows cut through the air. Men fell before they could even draw their swords. A dozen of his companions already lay motionless in the dirt. Heracles seized his club and waded into the battle, trying to reach the survivors who had formed a desperate circle near the building's gates.
"Stop!" he roared above the clash of weapons. "We are guests! Hippolyta gave us safe passage!"
But the Amazons pressed their attack, shouting in their own tongue about saving their queen. Through the melee, Heracles saw Hippolyta arrive, still buckling her breastplate, her hair loose from sleep. She looked around wildly, trying to understand the sudden violence. She took in the courtyard, from the dead Greeks to her warriors still fighting, and finally to Heracles himself. He stood among fallen Amazons, his club wet with blood, more bodies at his feet. The realization struck them both, though each saw a different truth. For Heracles, watching his men die while he stood unharmed, everything became clear. The long evening by the fire, the intimate conversation, her fascination with his stories, the wine that had made him drowsy, she had orchestrated it all. While he sat beside her, speaking of old battles and lost friends, her warriors had been preparing this massacre. The girdle itself had been the masterstroke. By giving it freely, she had made him believe in her sincerity, ensuring he would sleep soundly while death crept towards his men. For Hippolyta, seeing Heracles amid her dead warriors, another understanding dawned. The famous hero had come with armed men, claiming friendship while planning conquest. The request for her girdle had been nothing but deception. He had charmed her with false warmth, waiting for dawn when her warriors would be least prepared. Now Greeks and Amazons lay dead because she had been foolish enough to trust a man's word.
"You kept me distracted," Heracles said, his voice thick with rage. "All those questions about my techniques, my battles. You are learning how to defeat us."
Hippolyta's hand moved to her sword.
"And you came as a thief in friendship's clothing. I told you the truth about the girdle," Heracles shouted back.
She shook her head, her voice cracking with fury and hurt.
"To make me lower my guard! The girdle was never enough, was it? You wanted to conquer us, to drag me back to Greece as your prize."
She drew her sword and attacked. Heracles raised his club to deflect her blade, trying desperately to speak, to explain, but she pressed forward relentlessly, forcing him back across the bloodied courtyard. She fought as her father Ares had taught her, with 20 years of training behind every strike. Any other man would have died in the first exchange. When Hippolyta committed to a final thrust, certain her blade would pierce his heart, Heracles moved with the speed that had caught the golden hind. He stepped aside the arc of her sword, and his club swung down. The blow struck her temple with a dull crack. Her sword clattered to the floor as she collapsed beside it, her lips moving slightly, trying to form words. Then nothing. The Queen of the Amazons was dead, her girdle unable to save her, having been given away. For a heartbeat, the entire courtyard froze. The Amazons stared at their fallen queen, unable to comprehend that Hippolyta, daughter of Ares, lay dead on the stones. Then a wail went up from the nearest warrior, a sound of pure grief that spread through their ranks like a wave. Their attacks became wild with fury, all strategy abandoned in their need for vengeance. Heracles fought desperately, clearing space around him as spears thrust from every direction. Near the gates he spotted 4 of his men still standing, back to back, their swords keeping the Amazons at bay. He fought his way towards them. "The ship!" Heracles shouted when he reached them. Together they broke through the gates and ran through the streets, every step contested, arrows falling from windows, mounted warriors closing in from every side. They ran down the hillside path that led to the harbour, stumbling over loose stones in their haste. The beach spread out below them, and there were Amazons already at their ship, hacking at the hull with axes. Heracles charged straight into the water, his club crushing through their line as he reached the vessel. He put his shoulder to the hull and pushed with all his strength, feeling the ship groan and begin to move. His companions splashed through the shallows and climbed aboard, while Heracles continued shoving the vessel into deeper water. The Amazons came riding down the beach at full gallop, their horses' hooves throwing up sprays of sand and foam. They rode straight into the surf, the water rising to their horses' chests, still firing arrows. Heracles hauled himself over the side and grabbed the oars. Each pull took them further from shore, but the arrows continued to fall. The Amazons drove their horses deeper until the waves lifted the animals off their feet, before finally turning back. They had escaped, but only just. Of the 30 men who had sailed with Heracles from Greece, only 5 remained alive. 1 would die of his wounds before they reached the Hellespont. Another would never speak again of what happened at Themyscira. The journey home was silent. Heracles stood at the bow, the girdle in his hands, trying to understand what had happened. The peaceful evening, Hippolyta's generosity, then the sudden attack at dawn. Such a perfect reversal could only be divine work. He knew it was Hera poisoning minds with lies in the darkness. The goddess had turned a freely given gift into a massacre. When they finally reached Mycenae's harbour, only 4 men walked up the road to the palace. The guards at the gate stepped back when they saw Heracles' face, something in his expression warning them to stay silent. In the throne room, Eurystheus sat waiting with his daughter beside him. Admete leaned forward on her chair, eager to see the trophy she had requested. But when Heracles entered, her excitement faltered. This was not the hero who had left on a grand adventure. His shoulders were bent as if carrying an invisible weight, and dried blood still stained his lion's skin. Heracles approached the throne and held out the girdle. Its golden leather was decorated with intricate patterns showing scenes of battles and wild horses. Admete rose from her seat and reached for it eagerly, then hesitated. Something in the belt seemed wrong, though she could not say what. When she finally took it from Heracles' hands, the gold felt cold against her skin. "How did you—" she began, but the words died when she looked at Heracles' face. She clutched the girdle to her chest and hurried from the throne room, eager to try on her prize in private. She would find it heavier than expected, and somehow it would not suit her as she had imagined. Within the hour, she would store it in a cedar chest, never to wear it again. When the door closed behind his daughter, Eurystheus turned his attention back to Heracles. "You have completed 9 labours," the king said. "Your 10th will take you to Erythea, to the island at the western edge of the world. Bring me the cattle of Geryon." Heracles nodded once and left without a word. As he walked from the palace into the harsh afternoon sun, he could still feel the weight of the girdle in his hands, though it now belonged to Admete. First his wife and children were dead by his own hands. Then Chiron and Pholus, his teacher and friend, killed by his poisoned arrows. Now Hippolyta, the one person who had understood him, dead because of Hera's lies and his own rage. For all his divine strength, each loss carved something from him that could not be restored. The weight of these deaths was beginning to take its toll, becoming heavier than any burden a demigod could bear. Labour 10. The Cattle of Geryon. For his 10th labour, Heracles was commanded to travel to Erythea, an island at the western edge of the world, and steal the cattle belonging to Geryon, a giant with 3 heads and 3 bodies joined at the waist. When Eurystheus delivered this command, Heracles felt something close to relief. After the shadow that had fallen over him at Themyscira, after the weight of Hippolyta's death, perhaps distance would help. Perhaps at the edge of the world, far from Greece and its painful memories, he might find some measure of peace. He began the long journey southwest, following the African coastline where the Mediterranean narrowed towards its western mouth. The further south he travelled, the more the landscape changed. The familiar olive groves and pine forests of Greece gave way to endless stretches of sand and rock. The sun here was different, too, not the warm companion of Greek summers, but something hostile and relentless. It beat down on him from dawn until dusk, the heat so intense that each step felt like walking through fire. By the time Heracles reached the heart of the Libyan desert, his patience had worn thin. For 3 days he had walked under this merciless sun, the sand burning beneath his feet, his throat parched, despite the water he carried. On the 4th day, when the sun reached its zenith and the sand beneath his feet was hot enough to cook meat, something in Heracles snapped. He stopped in the middle of a vast dune, drew his bow and nocked one of his arrows, still black with the Hydra's blood.
"Enough!"
he roared at the sky.
"Helios! Come down here and face me, or I swear by my father Zeus I will shoot you from your chariot."
The threat of a poisoned arrow that had killed immortal Chiron was not one any god could ignore. The sun's movement across the sky suddenly stopped. Then, in a shimmer of golden light, the sun god descended to earth. Helios appeared as a tall figure wrapped in robes of woven sunlight, his hair like flames, his face almost too bright to look upon. But beneath his radiance there was genuine distress in his expression. "Heracles, son of Zeus," Helios said, his voice warm but worried, "you would not harm one who has never wronged you."
"You wrong me with every step through your domain," Heracles replied, his arrow now aimed at the god before him. "The sand burns, the air scorches my lungs. If you will not let me pass in peace, then we shall see if a god can survive the Hydra's venom."
Helios raised his arms in a gesture of peace. "Lower your bow, cousin. I cannot help that mortals, even half-divine ones, suffer under my daily passage, but I can offer you aid." The sun god gestured, and something extraordinary appeared in the sand before them. It was a vessel unlike anything made by mortal hands, a great golden cup, shaped like a water lily, large enough for a man to sit within. The metal seemed to glow with captured sunlight, and, despite being made of gold, it looked as if it would float, lighter than wood. "This is my cup," Helios explained. "Each night, when I complete my journey across the sky, I sail in this vessel through the waters of Oceanus, travelling beneath the earth to begin again in the east. Take it for your journey. It will bear you swiftly across any water, and while you travel in it, I will ensure my rays touch you more gently." Heracles lowered his bow, examining the magnificent gift. The cup was indeed large enough to hold him comfortably, its sides high enough to serve as a proper boat, despite its unusual shape. He placed his hand on the golden metal and found it cool to the touch, a blessed relief after days of burning heat.
"I accept your gift," Heracles said, "and I withdraw my threat."
Helios smiled, though relief was clear in his divine features. "Use it well, son of Zeus, and when your labours are complete, return it to any shore at sunset, and I will reclaim it." With that, the god ascended back to his chariot, and the sun's movement resumed, Though, true to his word, its heat seemed less oppressive. Heracles carried the golden cup to the coast, where the Mediterranean met the desert. The moment the cup touched water, it expanded slightly, becoming the perfect size for his journey. He climbed aboard, and immediately the vessel began to move, guided by some divine intelligence, towards his destination. The journey that would have taken weeks in a conventional ship passed in days. The cup sailed day and night without rest, skimming across the waves faster than any wind could push a sail. As Heracles neared the western edge of the Mediterranean, where the great sea opened into the vast ocean that surrounded the world, he decided to mark this achievement. He made landfall on both sides of the strait. On the African side, he climbed to the highest point and, with his incredible strength, raised a massive pillar of stone, carved with his name and deeds. Then he sailed across to the European shore and did the same, creating a matching monument. These pillars would stand for millennia, marking the gateway between the inner sea and the outer ocean. Sailors would know them as the Pillars of Hercules, and later ages would call them Ceuta and Gibraltar. But to Heracles, they were simply a sign that he had travelled further west than any Greek hero before him. Beyond the pillars, the ocean was different from any water Heracles had known. This was the domain of the Titan Oceanus, the great river that encircled the entire world. The waves here were mountain-high, far rougher than anything in the Mediterranean. Storms appeared from nowhere, with winds that could tear a normal ship to splinters. It was during one such storm that Heracles found himself in mortal danger. The waves rose higher than palace walls, lifting the golden cup to their peaks before dropping it into the troughs below. Each fall sent water rushing over the sides in torrents. The divine vessel, for all its magical properties, was filling rapidly. Heracles could barely keep his grip as the cup spun and rolled with each impact. When a massive wave nearly capsized it entirely, throwing him hard against the golden edge, his patience shattered. Fighting to keep his balance in the flooding vessel, he drew his bow with shaking hands.
"Oceanus!"
he shouted over the howling wind.
"Ancient Titan, calm your waters, or face the same fate as the immortal Chiron. These arrows know no difference between God and Titan."
The response was immediate. The waves flattened completely, and the storm clouds parted. In the suddenly still water, Heracles could see a vast face forming in the depths, made of flowing currents and sea foam. Oceanus himself was looking up at him, and in those watery features was unmistakable fear. The ancient Titan smoothed the waters around the golden cup and created a current beneath the vessel to carry it swiftly towards its destination. He had decided that helping Heracles reach his goal quickly was preferable to testing whether divine blood could survive the Hydra's poison. With Oceanus's current bearing him westward, Heracles soon saw Erythea on the horizon at sunset, an island at the western edge of the world. The sky here was always red, painting everything in shades of crimson and gold. The grass was the colour of wine, the rocks like dried blood. It was a place that belonged more to the realm of dreams than the waking world. As Heracles pulled the golden cup onto the shore, he could see the cattle immediately. They were impossible to miss, for these were no ordinary beasts. Their hides were the colour of sunset, red and gold and purple, and they were twice the size of normal cattle. They grazed on the strange crimson grass, guarded by two figures that would have sent any normal man fleeing. The first guardian Heracles faced was Eurytion, son of Ares and herdsman to Geryon. He was a giant in his own right, standing as tall as an ancient oak tree, carrying a club the size of a ship's mast. Beside him prowled Orthrus, the two-headed dog and brother to Cerberus. Each of its heads were the size of a lion's, with razor-sharp teeth and eyes that glowed with hellfire. In his current mood, exhausted from travel and weighed down by the deaths he carried, Heracles had no patience for a prolonged battle. When Eurytion charged at him, swinging his massive club, Heracles did not dodge or parry. He simply stepped forward, inside the arc of the swing, and struck once with his own club. The blow connected with Eurytion's knee, shattering it like pottery. As the giant fell, Heracles struck again, this time to the head. The son of Ares collapsed and did not rise. Orthrus lunged at him, both heads snapping for his throat. Heracles swung his club in a wide arc, striking both heads with a single blow. The two-headed dog collapsed instantly, its skull crushed by the force of the impact. It was then that Geryon himself appeared, alerted by the sounds of battle. He had 3 complete torsos, growing from a single waist, with 6 arms and 3 heads. Each body carried its own shield and spear, yet despite his size and strange form, he moved with surprising speed.
"You killed my herdsman and my dog,"
Geryon said, his 3 voices creating a deep rumble as he spoke.
"Now you come to steal my cattle?"
"I take no pleasure in their deaths," Heracles replied, already reaching for his bow. "I came for the cattle. Stand aside, and you need not share their fate." Geryon laughed.
"I am the grandson of Poseidon, the son of Chrysaor. My body is 3 times stronger than any mortal's. Your famous strength means nothing to—"
He never finished the sentence. Heracles had already drawn and released. The poisoned arrow struck exactly where the 3 torsos joined into one. For a moment the giant stood frozen, looking down at the arrow shaft protruding from his body. Then the Hydra's venom began its work. Black veins spread from the wound, racing up into all 3 torsos simultaneously. Geryon's 6 arms clutched at the wound, his 3 faces showing the same expression for the first time: agony. Within seconds he toppled backward, his giant body convulsing once before going still. Heracles felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. He had travelled to the edge of the world and killed 3 more beings, adding their deaths to his growing collection. He walked among the red cattle, counting perhaps 100 beasts, and began driving them towards the shore. When he reached the Golden Cup, he expected difficulty loading such a large herd. But as the first cattle approached, the vessel began to grow, stretching wider and deeper until it could accommodate them all. Whatever divine power Helios had woven into the cup allowed it to hold far more than its size suggested. The journey home began peacefully. The cattle stood calmly in the Golden Cup as it sailed across Oceanus's now quiet waters. But as they passed back through the Pillars of Hercules and entered familiar waters, Hera's rage finally boiled over. Again, she had watched a labour proceed too smoothly. Again, she had watched as Heracles completed what should have been an impossible task with disturbing ease. As the cup sailed along the Greek coast, she sent down a swarm of gadflies, each the size of a man's thumb, their stings like hot needles. They descended on the cattle in a buzzing cloud, driving the beasts mad with pain. The cattle bellowed and thrashed, several throwing themselves over the sides of the cup in their desperation to escape. They swam to shore and fled in all directions, scattering across the peninsula that stretched south from the Alps into the Mediterranean. Heracles spent an entire year recovering them. He pursued them through the rugged mountains that ran like a spine down the peninsula, across fertile valleys where the Etruscans dwelt, finding the scattered beasts one by one. Month after month passed, and gradually his herd grew complete again, all except for a single bull that had fled when he drove the recovered cattle near Rhegium at the southern tip of this foreign land. This last bull proved the most elusive of all. For months, Heracles tracked it through southern Europe, following reports of the creature as it wandered from village to village, even swimming across the strait from the mainland to Sicily. Wherever he went across this region, when he asked the local inhabitants about the runaway beast, they would respond using their word Italus, meaning bull. "The Italus went towards the hills," they would say, or, "We saw the Italus by the river yesterday." Heracles, hearing this word constantly during his search, began calling the entire region where he hunted by this name, Italia, or Italy, the land of the bull. When he finally captured the animal and returned to Greece, he spoke of his long pursuit through Italia. Thus these territories took their name from a single runaway bull, and the word entered the vocabulary of the Greeks and eventually the world. With all the cattle finally recovered after more than a year of pursuit, Heracles drove them back towards Greece and on to Mycenae. He had returned the golden cup to Helios earlier, leaving it on a western beach at sunset, where it vanished in a flash of golden light. Now, as he drove the red cattle through the gates of Eurystheus's palace, his steps were lighter than they had been in years. Soon, very soon, his servitude would end. Eurystheus waited in his courtyard as Heracles drove the cattle through the gates.
"The cattle of Geryon," Heracles announced with ceremony. "My 10th labour is complete."
Eurystheus examined the red cattle with satisfaction, already planning to sacrifice them to Hera. "Yes," he said slowly, "your 10th labour is complete." Heracles let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like years. 10 labours, 10 impossible tasks. He had lost his family, his friends, and parts of himself he could never recover, but it was over. He was free. The blood of his wife and children was finally washed clean. He turned to leave, already thinking of where he might go, what life he might build beyond the shadow of his crimes. "But you're not finished," Eurystheus said. Heracles stopped. Slowly he turned back to face the king. Eurystheus's smile was cold and satisfied. "Did you think I had forgotten? The terms were clear from the beginning. You were to complete your labours alone and without payment. Yet for your second labour, your nephew, Iolus, helped you defeat the Hydra, burning the necks while you cut the heads. That labour does not count." Heracles' hands clenched. But Eurystheus continued, growing bolder. "And the 5th labour, the Augean stables. You accepted payment from King Augeas, promised 1/10 of his cattle for the task. It matters not that he refused to pay when he learnt of your obligation to me. You accepted payment, therefore that labour too is invalid."
"You never said," Heracles began, a look of fury appearing on his face.
"I said you must complete 10 labours alone and without payment," Eurystheus interrupted, though he took a step back. "You have completed 8 valid labours. You owe me 2 more. Until you complete a full 12, your servitude continues, and the blood of your family remains on your hands." For a moment, Heracles stood absolutely still. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to spring forward and crush Eurystheus with all his might. This cowardly king, who had hidden in a jar at the sight of the Erymanthian boar, it would be so easy. One blow and Eurystheus would trouble him no more. But he knew what would follow. He would have broken his oath to serve, violated the judgment of the oracle at Delphi. The Furies would pursue him again, and his children's spirits would never find peace. Worse, he would have proved Hera right, that he was nothing but a killer, unable to control his rage.
"What would you have me do?"
Heracles asked, his voice now hollow. Eurystheus's smile widened. He had been planning this moment, consulting with priests and scholars to find the most impossible tasks remaining in all the world. "Your 11th labour," he announced with visible pleasure, "is to bring me the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides." Heracles closed his eyes. He could not believe such an impossible task had been set. The Hesperides were the nymphs who guarded Hera's sacred garden at the edge of the world, where golden apples grew on a tree given to the goddess as a wedding gift. The garden was protected by Lernean, the 100-headed dragon that never slept. This was not merely an impossible task, it was destined to be certain death. Without a word, Heracles turned and walked from the palace. Behind him he could hear Eurystheus laughing, believing he had finally won, that he had finally found a task that would defeat his mighty cousin. Each step away from the palace felt heavier than the last. He had thought he was finished. He had thought his suffering might finally end. Now he understood that Hera's hatred would never be satisfied, that his labours would continue until they finally killed him. Perhaps, he thought as he walked into the gathering darkness, that would be a mercy. Labour 11. The Apples of the Hesperides. For his 11th labour, Heracles had to retrieve the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, a task that would take him to the very edge of the world. The garden lay in the far west, where the Titan Atlas held up the heavens, and within it grew a tree that Gaia had given to Hera as a wedding gift when she married Zeus. The apples that hung from its branches were no ordinary fruit, for they granted immortality to anyone who ate them. Hera guarded them jealously, entrusting them to the Hesperides, daughters of night itself, and to Lernean, a dragon with 100 heads that never slept. No mortal had ever found this garden and lived to tell of it. Heracles stood outside Mycenae's gates, for the first time in all his labours uncertain where to even begin his journey. The garden could be anywhere in the vast western lands beyond the pillars he had erected. The poets sang of it being beyond the setting sun, but poets sang of many things that proved false. After days of contemplation, Heracles knew of only one being who might possess certain knowledge of its location: Prometheus, the Titan who had observed the world since the dawn of creation. But finding Prometheus would be its own challenge, for Zeus had hidden him well. The Titan had stolen fire from the gods and given it to mankind, and for this crime Zeus had chained him to a remote mountain in the Caucasus, condemning him to eternal agony as an eagle came each day to devour his regenerating liver. Heracles began his search in the lands of the Caucasus, following rumours and fragments of old stories. Mountain shepherds spoke in whispers of terrible screams that rang out from the highest peaks each day at noon. Travellers told of a great bird, larger than any eagle, that could be seen circling the same mountain peak every morning. Following these tales, Heracles climbed higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and cold winds cut through even his lion-skin cloak. It took weeks of searching among the desolate peaks, but finally, on a morning when frost covered the rocks, despite it being summer, Heracles heard it, a scream of agony that seemed to shake the very mountain. He followed the sound along treacherous paths where one false step would mean a fall of 1,000 feet. The screaming grew louder, punctuated by the harsh cry of an enormous bird. When Heracles finally climbed over a ridge and saw Prometheus, he stopped in horror. The Titan was spread against a massive boulder, his arms and legs stretched and bound with chains that had been driven deep into the rock itself. The metal had worn grooves into the Titan's immortal flesh over the centuries. But it was the eagle that made Heracles grip his bow in rage. The bird was monstrous, its wingspan wider than 3 men lying head to foot, and as Heracles watched, it tore into Prometheus's side, pulling out the Titan's liver in glistening strips. Prometheus screamed and thrashed against his bonds while the eagle fed, knowing its prey could not escape. "Enough!" Heracles roared, drawing his bow. The eagle turned towards him with one defiant shriek before Heracles' arrow took it through the breast. The bird fell from the rock face, tumbling down the mountainside until it disappeared into the mists below. Prometheus raised his head weakly, his cheeks gaunt from centuries of daily agony. His voice came out hoarse from screaming.
"Son of Zeus, have you come to witness the price of giving fire to humanity?"
"I have come seeking knowledge," Heracles replied, approaching the chains. "But first, no one deserves this fate." He examined the divine bonds, seeing how they had been fused directly into the rock. Even for his strength, breaking them would require tremendous effort. He gripped the first chain in both hands, bracing his feet against the stone. The metal was cold as ice and seemed to resist his touch, sending sharp pains through his palms. Heracles pulled with all his might, the muscles in his arms and back straining until they felt ready to tear. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like thunder, the first chain snapped. One by one, Heracles broke the remaining bonds, each one requiring every bit of strength he possessed. When the last chain fell away, Prometheus collapsed forward, free for the first time in centuries. The Titan's body immediately began to heal, the gaping wound in his side closing, though the memory of pain remained in his movements. He stood slowly, his joints cracking after so long in one position. Prometheus studied him for a long moment, then nodded.
"You have freed me when you could have simply demanded information. What knowledge do you seek, my friend?"
"The garden of the Hesperides," Heracles replied. "I must retrieve the golden apples that grow there." Prometheus's expression grew grave. The Titan moved to a flat stone and sat heavily, his strength still returning.
"Hera's most sacred place, where her golden apples grow. I will tell you how to find it, but know this, no mortal, not even one with divine blood, can pluck those apples from their tree. They exist simultaneously in both this world and the realm of the gods, beyond physical touch for any but the truly immortal." "Then how am I to complete this labour?" Heracles asked. "There is one who could help you," Prometheus said.
"My brother, Atlas, stands at the world's western edge, condemned to hold up the heavens for eternity. The garden lies near his post, and being a Titan, he could touch the apples. But convincing him to help you will require—" he paused for a moment— "creativity." Prometheus described the path to the garden. "Travel west to the edge of the world, where the land ends and the great ocean begins. There, where the sun touches the earth each evening before beginning its journey beneath the world, you will find both Atlas and the garden." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But know that the Hesperides who guard those apples are daughters of night itself, and they have tended that tree since before Zeus claimed his throne. With them is Ladon, a dragon with 100 heads, and never do all of them sleep at once. You will need more than strength to succeed." Heracles made the long journey west for many months, following the path Prometheus had described. He travelled beyond the lands known to Greeks, past strange kingdoms where men spoke in unfamiliar tongues, until at last he reached the edge of the world itself. Despite Prometheus's warning about the apples being beyond mortal touch, Heracles remained confident. He had accomplished the impossible before. Surely his divine strength would be enough to pluck a few apples from a tree. There, in a valley where the sun touched the earth each evening, he found the garden of the Hesperides. The air here was thick with golden light that seemed to hang suspended, neither rising nor falling, as if the sun had paused mid-setting and forgotten to continue. Strange flowers grew along the path, their petals translucent and glowing faintly from within. As he descended towards the garden, he heard singing that drifted through the air like smoke, women's voices weaving together in harmonies that made his steps slow without him realizing. Every tree bore fruit of different metals: silver pears, copper plums, gold-leafed figs. The grass beneath his feet was soft as silk and seemed to bend away before he stepped, as if reluctant to be crushed. Streams of water ran uphill between the trees, flowing in spirals that hurt to follow with mortal eyes. In the garden's centre stood the tree. It was not large, no taller than a normal apple tree, but its presence dominated everything around it. The bark was silver, the leaves gold, and the apples themselves shone like miniature suns. Just looking at them made Heracles' mouth water with a hunger he had never felt before, a hunger not of the body but of the soul, the desire for immortality that lurked in every mortal heart. Around the tree danced the Hesperides, Aigle, Erythea, Hesperii, and Arethusa. They were beautiful beyond description, their skin touched with the golden hue of sunset, their dark hair unbound and reaching to their waists. They sang as they danced, and their song was about the beginning of all things, when the tree first sprouted from Gaia's earth. But coiled around the tree's trunk was Ladon, more terrible than Heracles had imagined. From a single massive body rose 100 serpentine necks, writhing and swaying without rest. Each head watched in a different direction. Some scanned the sky, others watched the paths between the trees, and still others twisted to observe what lay behind. The dragon's scales were iridescent, shining from green to purple to black wherever the light touched them. True to Prometheus's warning, some heads were always alert, while others dozed, ensuring the guardian never fully slept. Without hesitation, Heracles shot one of his poisoned arrows into Ladon's body, where all the necks converged. The dragon's 100 heads swung towards him in unison, but the Hydra's venom was already at work. The great guardian swayed once, then collapsed with a tremendous crash that shook the ground beneath Heracles' feet, falling beside the tree it had protected since the dawn of time. The Hesperides approached the fallen dragon, genuine sorrow evident in their bearing. Aigle, the eldest, knelt beside Ladon and placed her hand on its scales. "You have killed our companion," she said to Heracles, her voice gentle and sombre. "He was set here by Hera herself, and now his watch has ended." "I take no pleasure in it," Heracles replied, and meant it. "But I must have the golden apples." "Then take them," Hesperii said, gesturing to the tree. "If you can." Heracles approached the tree and reached for the lowest hanging apple. His hand passed through it, as if it were made of mist. He tried again, grasping at different fruits, but each time his fingers found nothing but air. The apples existed, he could see them, smell their sweet fragrance, but they were beyond his physical reach. The Hesperides laughed, though not unkindly. "Did you think it would be so simple?" Hesperii asked. "These apples are not for mortal hands, not even those with divine blood. Only true immortals may harvest them." Frustrated, but remembering Prometheus's advice, Heracles left the garden. The Hesperides made no move to stop him, returning to their eternal dance around the tree, though their songs now carried a note of sadness for their fallen guardian. Finding Atlas was not difficult. Even from a great distance, Hercules could see the Titan, for he was massive beyond comprehension. Atlas stood at the western edge of the world, where the land ended and the great river Oceanus began. His feet were planted in valleys, his knees level with the mountains, and his shoulders disappeared into the clouds. Upon those shoulders rested the entire vault of the heavens, the celestial sphere that held all the stars and the paths of the sun and moon. As Heracles approached, he could see the strain in every part of the Titan's body. Every muscle in Atlas's colossal form was tensed, had been tensed for eons, holding up a weight beyond mortal comprehension.
"Atlas!"
Heracles called out, though he had to shout with all his might for his voice to reach the Titan's ears.
"I am Heracles, son of Zeus, and I have come to ask for your help."
The Titan's head slowly turned downward, taking in the tiny figure at his feet. When he spoke, his voice rumbled across the valley.
"Son of Zeus, your father is the one who condemned me to this fate. Why would I help his spawn?"
"Because I offer you something you have not had since the great war between the gods and Titans," Heracles replied. "Rest. I will hold the sky while you retrieve the golden apples from the garden nearby. You can touch them where I cannot." For the first time in centuries, Atlas's expression changed, hope flickering across his massive features.
"You would take this burden, even for a moment?"
"I would," Heracles said, though looking at the Titan's suffering, he wondered if he truly could. Atlas considered for a long moment, then gestured to a nearby mountain peak that rose to his shoulder height.
"Very well. Climb up there, and I will transfer the burden to you. But know this, Heracles, the weight of the heavens is not just physical. It is the weight of existence itself, the separation between order and chaos. If you drop it, everything ends."
Heracles climbed the mountain, and when he reached the peak, he positioned himself beneath where Atlas held the celestial sphere. Slowly, carefully, Atlas transferred the weight onto the hero's shoulders. The moment it settled upon him, Heracles' knees buckled. Only by calling upon every reserve of strength, every bit of divine power in his blood, did he keep from being crushed instantly. His muscles screamed in protest, feeling as if they would tear from his bones. His vision blurred from the effort, and sweat poured from him in streams. Atlas stepped away from his burden and rolled his massive shoulders.
"I had forgotten," he said in wonder, "what it felt like to stand without weight."
He looked down at Heracles for a long moment, then spoke again.
"You are stronger than I expected. Very well, I will fetch your apples from the garden."
The Titan strode off towards the garden, his massive steps covering leagues at a time. Heracles remained, trembling under the weight, counting each heartbeat, each breath, wondering if the next would be his last. Time lost all meaning. Had Atlas been gone for minutes, hours, days? The sun seemed to move across the sky, but Heracles could not tell if it was real or his mind breaking under the strain. His legs had long since gone numb. His arms felt like they were being slowly pulled from their sockets. Blood ran from his nose and ears from the pressure. Just when he thought he could bear no more, that he would have to let the sky fall and end everything, Atlas returned. The Titan carried a basket woven from clouds, filled with the golden apples. He set them down carefully, then stood looking at Heracles with an expression that was hard to read.
"You know," Atlas said slowly, "I have been thinking as I walked. This burden has been mine for so long, but you seem to be managing it well enough. Perhaps I should take these apples to Eurystheus for you. It would be faster with my great strides. You could wait here, holding the sky, just a bit longer, and I would return soon."
Through his agony, Heracles understood. Atlas had no intention of returning. But the hero had not survived 10 labours by strength alone.
"Generous offer,"
Hercules gasped, each word an effort.
I accept, but before you go, help me for just a moment. I need to adjust my lion skin to pad my shoulders. The stars are cutting into my flesh. Just hold the sky for one moment while I position the pelt better.
Atlas nodded. It was a reasonable request, and he wanted Heracles to be comfortable enough to hold the burden for the long journey to Mycenae. The Titan reached up and took back the weight of the heavens. The instant the weight left his shoulders, Heracles stepped away and picked up the basket of apples. "My thanks, Atlas," he said, backing away quickly, "but I think I will deliver these myself." Atlas understood immediately what had happened.
"You tricked me!"
he roared, his voice shaking the mountains.
"You dare use my own kindness against me?"
Atlas's rage was terrible to behold. He roared and cursed, his fury so great that the earth trembled and rocks tumbled from the nearby cliffs, swearing by all the Titans that Heracles would suffer for this deception. But he could not pursue, could not even move. For the moment he tried, the sky would fall. He was trapped again, now knowing for certain that he had been mere moments from freedom. The journey back to Mycenae took weeks. Heracles' body was so damaged from holding the sky that he could barely walk at first. His shoulders bore permanent bruises in the shape of constellations, marks that would never fully fade. But he had the apples, glowing in their basket, filling the air around him with the scent of immortality. When he finally arrived at the palace and presented the golden apples to Eurystheus, even he could not hide his amazement. He held one of the apples up, mesmerized by its golden glow, perhaps imagining what it would be like to eat it and live forever.
11 labors complete,
Heracles said, straightening his shoulders despite his exhaustion. At last, only one more remained. Eurystheus set the apple down carefully, his expression growing calculating once more. "Yes, 11 labours are now complete, but one more remains before your service ends." He paused. "For your 12th and final labour, you will bring me Cerberus, the 3-headed hound who guards the gates of the underworld, and you must bring him back alive." Heracles closed his eyes. Of course. He would have to journey to the underworld itself, to the realm of the dead, and somehow convince Hades to let him borrow his most faithful guardian. That evening, Eurystheus ordered his servants to carry the golden apples to Athena's temple. Hera had already sent word that the king could not keep them, for they belonged to her sacred garden and nowhere else. The apples were placed on the goddess's altar, and by the following morning Athena had spirited them away, returning them to the Hesperides at the edge of the world. That same night, Heracles set out from Mycenae, walking west along the road that led towards dark forests. The full moon hung overhead, casting silver light through the trees, and somewhere in the distant mountains, wolves began to howl. As he walked, Heracles thought about what he had just accomplished at the edge of the world. He had held up the entire sky, felt its impossible weight crushing down on him, and yet he had survived. Now he would descend to the realm of the dead itself. If he could bear the weight of the heavens, perhaps he could endure whatever waited him in Hades' kingdom. Labor 12. The Capture of Cerberus. For his 12th and final labour, Heracles had been commanded to descend into the underworld itself and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of the dead. No living mortal who entered Hades' realm had ever returned, yet this was precisely what Eurystheus demanded. Before attempting such a journey, Heracles travelled to Eleusis, where the priests initiated him into the sacred mysteries. These rituals would offer some protection in the realm of the dead. From there, he made his way to Cape Taenarum, where a deep cave served as one of the entrances to the underworld. He had barely reached the cave when Hermes appeared beside him, wearing his travelling cloak and winged sandals. "Brother," Hermes said, for they shared Zeus as their father, "I have come to guide you through the realm of the dead. Without my assistance, you would wander lost in those passages until your body failed and your spirit joined the countless souls below." Heracles bowed his head in gratitude. "I welcome your guidance. There is something else you must understand," Hermes continued as they began their descent into the cave. "Cerberus is not simply another monster to overcome. He is the guardian appointed by Hades himself. To take him without permission would bring down a curse that even our father could not lift. You must present yourself to Hades and Persephone and ask their consent." The path wound downward through narrow passages that grew colder with each step. The rock walls were cold and damp to the touch, and the air grew thick and stale. After what felt like hours of descent through the dark and winding tunnels, they heard the sound of flowing water and emerged into a vast cavern. Before them stretched the river Styx, its waters completely black and moving with an unnatural thickness, like oil rather than water. On the shore waited Charon, the ferryman of the dead. His face was gaunt, his robes faded to the point of being colourless. He extended one bony hand towards them. "Payment," he rasped. "None cross without payment." Heracles had no coin, for the living did not carry the obols that were placed under the tongue of the dead. But Hermes stepped forward and spoke quietly to the ferryman. Whatever the god said was sufficient, for Charon lowered his hand and gestured to his boat. The crossing was conducted in complete silence, with Heracles watching shapes move beneath the dark water, pressing up against the bottom of the boat. When they reached the far shore and stepped onto solid ground, the gates of Hades' realm rose before them, enormous doors of black iron that stretched up into the gloom above. And lying before those gates was Cerberus. The dog was larger than any creature Heracles had encountered except for Atlas himself. Each of its 3 heads was the size of a full-grown bull, with teeth that jutted out like tusks. Its body was covered in black fur, and along its neck and spine, instead of a mane, writhed dozens of living serpents that hissed and struck at the air. Its tail ended not in fur, but in a dragon's head, with its own set of fangs. When the creature noticed their approach, all 3 heads turned in their direction, and from 3 throats came a deep growl that made the ground vibrate beneath their feet. At a gesture from Hermes, Cerberus settled back down, recognizing the god's authority. They passed through the gates and walked among the countless spirits of the dead until they reached the palace of Hades. The throne room was vast and cold, and there sat Hades on his ebony throne, his skin as pale as the ghosts who served him. Beside him sat his queen, Persephone, whose beauty remained undimmed even in this realm of death. "Lord Hades, Queen Persephone," Heracles said, bowing low, "I have come to ask a favour. My final labour requires me to bring Cerberus to the world above. I ask your permission to borrow your guardian." Hades leaned forward, studying Heracles carefully. "You are among the very few living mortals to enter my realm and address me directly. Most who attempt such a thing join my subjects permanently. Why should I allow you to take Cerberus, who has guarded my gates faithfully since the Titans were imprisoned?" Before Heracles could respond, Persephone placed her hand on her husband's arm. "This one's labours were ordained by Hera's jealousy, my lord. We understand something of unjust punishments, do we not?" Hades considered this, his fingers tapping slowly on the arm of his throne. "Hera has indeed shown little respect for our realm, considering it beneath her notice. Very well, it would amuse me to assist one she seeks to destroy." He fixed his gaze on Heracles. "But I have conditions. First, you must subdue Cerberus using only your hands. No weapons, no chains, until he submits. Second, once you have shown him to Eurystheus, you must return him immediately. Third, no lasting harm must come to him. Agree to these terms, or leave my realm at once." "I will abide by your conditions," Heracles said. Hades raised one hand. "Before you attempt this task, walk among my subjects. See what awaits all mortals, even heroes. Hermes will guide you through the fields of the dead, then bring you back to face Cerberus." Hermes led Heracles from the throne room to the fields of Asphodel, where the common dead dwelt. The spirits here were countless, grey forms that barely held human shape. They drifted past without seeming to notice the living man among them, though some reached out with transparent fingers as if trying to remember what solid flesh felt like. As they walked, a figure suddenly materialized in front of them that made Heracles step back in surprise. It was Medusa, the Gorgon slain by Perseus years before. Her face, once deadly to look upon, was now merely sad. The snakes that had been her hair hung limp and motionless. She looked at Heracles for a moment with what seemed like recognition. Then fear crossed her features. Before he could speak, she turned and glided away, vanishing among the other souls. "Even monsters become mere shadows here," Hermes observed. They continued through the fields until they heard Heracles' name being called. Turning, he saw a spirit approaching whose form was clearer than the common ghosts around them. It was Meleager, the prince of Calydon, whom Heracles had met at gatherings of heroes. The young man had been full of life then. Now he was a pale reflection of his former self. "Heracles," Meleager said, his voice hollow but clear, "I did not expect to see you here. Have you joined the dead as well?" "No, friend. I still breathe. I have come for Cerberus as my final labour." Heracles looked at the pale form before him. "But you were so young. How did you come to be here?" Meleager's form seemed to dim slightly. "A curse from my youth finally claimed me. My mother burned the brand that held my life force, and as it turned to ash, so did I. But that is done now." He moved closer, and Heracles felt the cold that emanated from all the dead. "I would ask something of you, if you would hear it." "Speak," Heracles said. "My sister Deianira still lives. She is unmarried, and with me gone, she has no protector. You are the greatest hero of our age. Would you consider taking her as your wife? She is beautiful and kind, and deserves someone who can keep her safe." Heracles thought of his years of solitude since he had killed his first wife and children in Hera's madness. "When my labours are complete, I will seek her out. This I swear to you." Relief showed on Meleager's face. "Thank you. That brings me peace." He was already beginning to fade, drifting back among the countless dead. "Remember the living, Heracles. We are all shades, soon enough." Meleager vanished, and Hermes led Heracles back to the gates where Cerberus waited. The great dog was awake now, all 3 heads alert and watching. Heracles removed his lion skin cloak and set aside his club. He would face this challenge as Hades demanded, with only his bare hands. When Heracles got within reach, all 3 heads lunged at once. The hero caught the middle head in his arms while using his body weight to pin the creature down. The other 2 heads snapped at him, teeth grazing his arms and drawing blood, while the serpents along the dog's spine struck repeatedly, their venom burning his skin, though not deadly to one with divine blood. For hours they struggled there before the gates, rolling and grappling in the grey dust of the underworld. Cerberus was strong, perhaps stronger than any creature Heracles had faced, but the hero had held up the sky itself and survived. As the hours passed, the great dog's movements began to slow, its struggles grew weaker, its 3 heads beginning to droop one by one, until finally, with a low whine from all 3 throats, Cerberus went limp in surrender. Heracles loosened his grip carefully, but kept his hands ready. Near the gates lay a massive chain, likely used by Hades when the dog needed restraining. He fastened it around the middle neck, and Cerberus did not resist, understanding he had been defeated. The journey back to the surface was long and strange. As they climbed the winding path towards daylight, Cerberus began to whimper, sensing something unfamiliar ahead. The dog had never seen the sun, never felt its warmth. When they finally emerged from the cave at Cape Tinarum, and the first rays of sunlight struck Cerberus's black fur, the creature howled in confusion and fear. Foam dripped from all 3 mouths as his 6 eyes squinted against the brightness he had never experienced. The journey to Mycenae would take several days, and from the very start it was clear that Cerberus could not tolerate the world above. The sunlight tormented him, and he drooled constantly as they walked, leaving a trail of saliva that burned the grass beneath. Wherever these drops fell, a poisonous plant would later grow that men would call wolfsbane. As they passed through villages, people fled at the sight of the underworld's guardian, barricading themselves behind doors until the monster had passed. When they finally reached the palace at Mycenae, word of their approach had already spread. Heracles found Eurystheus not on his throne, but already hiding in his bronze jar, a now permanent installation next to his throne. Only the king's head was visible above the rim, his face white with terror. "Is this proof enough?" Heracles asked, holding Cerberus's chain. The dog sat on his haunches, all 3 heads turned towards the jar, growling softly at the king. "Yes, yes!" Eurystheus shrieked. "Take it away! Your labours are complete! All 12 tasks are finished. You are released from your service. Your crimes are pardoned. Just remove that monster from my palace." Heracles felt an immense weight lift from his shoulders. After years of servitude, after 12 impossible tasks that had taken him to the ends of the earth and beyond, he was finally free. The blood of his wife and children was washed clean. He could begin his life once more. Without another word to Eurystheus, Heracles led Cerberus from the palace. He had a promise to keep. The journey back to Cape Tinarum was swifter, for Cerberus seemed to sense he was going home. With each mile closer to the cave, the dog's steps grew quicker, his whimpering ceased. When they finally began climbing the rocky path to the cave entrance, the dog's demeanour changed completely. His 3 heads lifted, and his tail, dragon head and all, swayed with something like happiness. At the cave entrance, Heracles knelt and removed the chain. Cerberus shook himself vigorously, all three heads moving in unison, then looked at Heracles for a long moment. The hero reached out and patted the middle head carefully. The dog leaned into the touch briefly, then turned and disappeared into the darkness, padding down the familiar path to resume his eternal watch. As Heracles stood, Hades appeared at the cave mouth, his pale form just visible in the shadows. "You have kept your word, Heracles. Few mortals can claim such honor. Go now, return to your life. Your labors are complete, your crimes forgiven. But know that one day, like all mortals, you will return here permanently. When that day comes, Cerberus will remember you, and his greeting will be gentler." Heracles bowed to the Lord of the Dead. As the god faded back into his realm, Heracles turned from Cape Taenarum and walked into the sunlight, truly free for the first time in years. As he went, he thought of all he had endured. 12 labors that had seemed impossible, yet he had completed them all. He had travelled to the edges of the world and beyond, faced monsters and gods, held up the sky, and walked among the dead. Now, at last, he could live again. But even as he walked away from Cape Taenarum, Heracles knew that peace was not truly in his nature. There would be other adventures, other challenges. For now, though, he was free, and that was enough. Part 5. The Death of Heracles. Heracles took some time to celebrate when he returned from his labours, enjoying all the pleasures of a free life. Wine flowed freely in the taverns of Thebes, and the clink of bronze cups followed him wherever he went. He was now a well-renowned hero, and had admirers in every Greek city, from the marble temples of Athens to the dusty streets of Sparta. Crowds would gather just to glimpse the man who had strangled the Nemean lion with his bare hands, who had dragged the three-headed Cerberus from the underworld itself. His bronze skin bore the scars of 1,000 battles, each one a story that tavern-goers begged to hear over their evening wine. He would go on several more adventures, even joining the hero Jason and the Argonauts on their legendary quest for the Golden Fleece, sailing beyond the edge of the known world. But as the seasons turned and the olive trees blossomed again, Heracles remembered a promise he had made to Meleager in the underworld. True to his word, he sought out his sister Deianira in the kingdom of Caledon, and soon the two were wed in a ceremony befitting a hero of his stature. The wedding feast lasted 7 days, with bulls roasted whole and amphoras of wine emptied by celebrating guests. The newlyweds set out for their new home in the walled city of Tiryns, travelling along dusty mountain paths beneath the scorching Greek sun. Their journey took them through pine forests where cicadas sang their endless summer song, past shepherds tending their flocks on rocky hillsides. The trip was peaceful until they reached the banks of the river Evenus, where the spring floods had transformed the usually calm waters into a raging torrent. The current crashed against the rocks with such force that white foam sprayed high into the air, and the sound of rushing water filled the valley. As Heracles studied the treacherous crossing, calculating how best to ford the waters while keeping his new bride safe, a figure emerged from the tree line on the opposite bank. It was a centaur, massive and muscular, with the powerful body of a chestnut horse and the torso of a weathered man. His hooves struck the stones as he descended to the water's edge, and the creature waded into the river with confident strides, the churning water barely reaching his equine belly.
Great Hercules!
The centaur called out, his deep voice carrying over the roar of the rapids.
I am a ferryman of these waters, known to all who travel this road. Allow me to carry your beautiful bride across on my back. My 4 legs are steadier than 2 in such currents, and I have crossed this river 1,000 times.
Heracles, confident in his own strength, but concerned for Deianira's safety, studied the centaur for a moment. The creature seemed honest enough, and the crossing would indeed be dangerous for Deianira on foot. With a grateful nod, he accepted the offer. What he failed to recognize in that fateful moment was that this was no ordinary ferryman. This was Nessus, the sole survivor of the massacre Heracles had committed against the Centaur tribe years ago on the way to his 4th labor. That day, Heracles had killed dozens of centaurs with his poisoned arrows after they had attacked him at a friend's cave. Nessus alone had escaped by diving into this very river, and for over a decade since, he had nursed his hatred like a carefully tended flame, waiting for the perfect moment to exact his revenge. Deianira climbed onto the centaur's broad back, her wedding robes trailing as she gripped his shoulders. Nessus stepped into the churning water, his powerful legs finding purchase on the slippery riverbed. Step by step he carried her through the rapids, each stride steady despite the rushing waters. Heracles watched them progress halfway across, then began his own crossing, his mighty arms pulling him through the current that would have swept away a lesser man. But as soon as Nessus's hooves touched the muddy ground of the far bank, everything changed. With sudden, shocking violence, he threw Deianira to the ground, a cry of surprise turning to terror as the centaur loomed over her, his true intentions horrifyingly clear. The peaceful riverside became a scene of nightmare in an instant. Deianira's scream carried across the water to where Heracles stood waist-deep in the rapids. In one swift motion, he pulled his great bow from his back and drew it to its full extent, the wood creaking under the strain. The arrow he nocked had been dipped in the Hydra's venomous blood years before, its poison still potent. He released. The arrow punched through Nessus's chest with such force that the centaur staggered backwards, his 4 legs buckling beneath him. Dark blood, almost black, began pooling on the muddy riverbank. The centaur collapsed onto his side, his equine body shuddering with each laboured breath. In his last moments, as Heracles was still fighting his way through the current, Nessus beckoned Deianira closer with a trembling hand. She approached cautiously, still shaking from the ordeal.
Lady,
he wheezed, blood frothing at his lips as he spoke,
I beg your forgiveness. Let me give you a gift to atone for my terrible actions.
His voice grew weaker with each word, but his eyes held a strange intensity.
My blood, it carries the power of love itself. Collect it in a vial. Should Heracles ever stray, should his eyes ever turn to another woman, anoint his clothing with it, and his heart will return to you alone. This I swear by the river Styx.
As the light faded from the centaur's eyes and his massive body grew still, Deianira stood frozen for a moment. The oath by the Styx was sacred, unbreakable even in death. Shaken and desperate to believe something good could come from this terrible moment, she found a small clay vial in her travel pack and quietly filled it with the centaur's blood, the dark liquid still warm. She wrapped it carefully in cloth and hid it deep among her belongings, never suspecting that she had just become an unwitting accomplice in a dying creature's elaborate revenge. The couple continued on to Tiryns, where they lived happily for a time. The city's high walls provided safety, and their home near the palace was filled with the laughter of the several children they bore together. The years passed peacefully, with Heracles teaching his sons to draw a bow and telling them stories of his 12 labours. However, after several years of this domestic tranquillity, Heracles became restless. The quiet life of a father and husband began to weigh on him. He would stand on the city walls at sunset, gazing towards distant mountains, remembering the thrill of adventure, the satisfaction of conquest. His mighty hands, which had strangled monsters and moved rivers, now seemed wasted on the gentle tasks of peacetime. Seeking some taste of his former glory, he left his family behind one spring morning and set out alone for the kingdom of Oechalia. This was where his old archery tutor, Eurytus, now ruled as king. Eurytus had been the one who taught young Heracles to draw a bow, to judge wind and distance, to send an arrow through a ring at 100 paces. The reunion should have been joyful, but fate had other plans. Once Heracles arrived at the stone palace of Oechalia, it took only a few days for disaster to strike. At a feast in the great hall, he laid eyes upon Iole, the daughter of King Eurystheus. She was young and graceful, her dark hair bound with golden ribbons, drawing the attention of every warrior present. Heracles, who had faced monsters without flinching, found himself utterly captivated. King Eurystheus, perhaps sensing danger, announced that he was holding an archery tournament. The winner would receive Iole's hand in marriage, a prize worthy of the greatest warriors in Greece. The tournament drew competitors from across the land. They gathered in the palace courtyard, where targets had been set at increasing distances. One by one the archers fell away as the challenges grew harder. But Heracles, drawing on the very skills Eurytus had taught him years before, struck every target dead center. His final shot split the arrow of his last remaining competitor, a feat that drew gasps from the watching crowd. However, when Heracles stepped forward to claim his prize, King Eurystheus's face darkened like a storm cloud. "No," the king declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I know who you are, Heracles. I know what you did to your first family, how madness took you and you slaughtered your own children. I will not hand my daughter over to a man who might one day turn on her in the same way." The courtyard fell silent. Heracles' face flushed red, then white with rage. His fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles cracked like breaking wood. Without a word, he stormed from the palace, but everyone present knew this was not the end. They had seen that look in the hero's eyes before, the look of a man whose pride had been wounded beyond endurance. He returned 3 days later, not as a suitor, but as a conqueror. Under the cover of darkness, while the palace slept, Heracles struck. He moved through the women's quarters quickly and quietly, seizing Iole along with her handmaidens and several other noble women of the household. Their cries were muffled, their struggles useless against his superhuman strength. By dawn, he was already on the road back to Tiryns, driving his captives before him like a shepherd with a stolen flock. The arrival at Tiryns was a scene of confused emotions. Deianira, standing in the courtyard of their home, initially felt joy at seeing her husband's familiar figure approaching along the dusty road. Her children ran forward, calling out to their father, but as the group drew closer, her happiness curdled into dread. She saw the women, dishevelled and frightened, huddled together in fear, and then she saw Iole. The young woman rode beside Heracles, seated on her own horse rather than bound like a prisoner. When they stopped in the courtyard, Deianira watched as her husband helped Iole down, his hands lingering on her waist far longer than necessary, his fingers reluctant to let go. The gesture was tender, protective. That touch told Deianira everything. This was not mere desire for a beautiful captive, but something far more dangerous. She felt her heart grow cold within her chest. That night, as Heracles bathed and prepared for the evening feast to celebrate his return, Deianira retreated to her private chamber. With shaking hands, she retrieved the hidden vial of Nessus's blood from its hiding place. The dark liquid had thickened over the years, but had not dried. She unwrapped it carefully, remembering the centaur's dying words. Perhaps there was still hope. Perhaps she could win back her husband's wandering heart. She selected one of Heracles' finest robes, a white garment embroidered with golden thread, the kind he wore for special occasions. Working quickly, before she could lose her nerve, she smeared the centaur's blood across the inside of the fabric. The blood soaked into the white wool, leaving dark stains that looked almost like wine in the lamplight. She folded the robe carefully and sent it to Heracles with a servant, along with a message asking him to wear it to dinner that evening as a sign of his love for her. When Heracles put the robe on in his chamber, pulling it over his scarred shoulders, he noticed nothing at first. The fabric felt normal against his skin, perhaps slightly warm, but the evening was humid. He adjusted the garment and turned to leave for the feast. Then the pain began. It started as a tingling sensation, like ants crawling across his back. Within seconds it became a burning unlike anything he had ever experienced. The blood of Nessus, tainted with the Hydra's poison, began to activate from the warmth of his body. The fabric seemed to melt into his skin, fusing with his flesh as if it were made of molten metal. Heracles let out a roar of agony that shook the walls of the house. He tried to tear the robe off, his mighty hands gripping the fabric. But as he pulled, he tore away not just cloth, but chunks of his own flesh. Skin came away in long strips, muscle visible beneath. "Water!" he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "Bring water!" Servants rushed forward with amphoras and basins, pouring cool water over his burning skin, but no amount could wash away the poison that was now eating through his flesh. The venom spread like liquid fire through his veins, each heartbeat pumping agony to every corner of his body. The centaur Nessus had planned this perfectly. He knew that Heracles would shoot him with a poisoned arrow when he attacked Deianira. By convincing her to gather his blood, already tainted with the Hydra's venom, Nessus had crafted the perfect revenge. Heracles would die from his own weapon, destroyed by the very poison he had used to kill so many. The hero stumbled from his chamber into the courtyard, his screams echoing through the night. Servants fled in terror at the sight of him, his body steaming as the poison ate through his flesh. Deianira, hearing the commotion, ran from her room. When she saw what her gift had done, when she understood the magnitude of her deception, she let out a wail of despair. Without a word, she ran back to her chamber. Minutes later, her body was found hanging from the ceiling beam, a silken cord around her neck. Heracles' torment continued through the night. The Hydra's poison that had killed so many now worked its terrible magic on the greatest hero of Greece. His skin blackened and peeled away, his muscles spasmed uncontrollably. In his agony, he ranged through the courtyard like a wounded bull, his strength still tremendous even as his body failed. Knowing his death was approaching, knowing there would be no victory over this enemy, he began frantically tearing up young trees from the garden with his bare hands. His children watched from the windows, weeping as their father, mad with pain, constructed his own funeral pyre in the courtyard. Once the pyre was assembled, a rough pyramid of wood and torn branches reaching twice the height of a man, Heracles climbed to its top. His body was a ruin, flesh hanging in tatters, the poison still burning through him like acid. He lay down upon the wood and called out to his friend Philoctetes, who had arrived during the night. "Light it!" Heracles gasped, each word an effort. "End this torment!" Philoctetes wept as he brought the torch to the wood. The dry branches caught immediately, flames racing up towards where the hero lay. As the fire reached Heracles, as it began to consume what remained of his mortal body, something strange happened. Through the unbearable agony of burning, a smile appeared on the hero's ravaged face. The fire was burning away the poison at last, ending the hideous pain of the Hydra's venom. It was at this moment that the clear night sky suddenly darkened. A great storm cloud, appearing from nowhere, gathered above the funeral pyre. Thunder rumbled, though no rain fell, and lightning flickered within the cloud's depths. In that cloud sat Zeus, king of the gods, watching as the mortal part of his most famous son burned away. The god had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Heracles would be freed from his mortal flesh. As the flames consumed the last of Heracles' earthly body, Zeus reached down through the smoke and fire. His divine hand grasped not flesh but spirit, pulling forth the immortal essence of Heracles. The hero's soul rose up through the smoke, through the clouds, ascending to Olympus itself. There, in the halls of the gods, Zeus completed the work begun so many years ago when he had fathered Heracles. He transformed his son fully into an immortal, a god who would sit forever among the Olympians. His labors finally, truly complete. Epilogue. The Eternal Hero. For over 2,000 years, Heracles and his story have endured. Roman emperors commissioned statues of themselves wearing his lion skin, desperate to claim even a fraction of his power. Artists from every age have painted his labors. Writers have retold his struggles in 1,000 different ways. Yet the true power of Heracles lies not in his divine strength or his 12 labors, but in what his story teaches us about the human condition. Here was a hero who could strangle lions and divert rivers, yet could not escape his own rage, who completed impossible tasks, yet found his greatest enemy within himself, who had achieved immortality, but only after losing everything he held dear. Through Heracles, we see our own struggles elevated to the realm of myth, the burden of our mistakes, the weight of redemption, the price of glory. True strength is found not in conquest, but in perseverance, not in perfection, but in the courage to continue despite our flaws. From ancient Greece to today, from marble statues to cinema screens, his influence remains unbroken. Neither man nor God, but something in between, forever reminding us that even the mightiest among us are still human. I've been David Rintoul for Deep Dive History. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye.